Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. I never thought I'd be one of those people who would have something to say about a haunting. I've always been skeptical, dismissing strange noises or feelings as the result of stress or overactive imaginations. But that weekend, my beliefs changed forever. My friends and I had rented an old house for a quiet weekend getaway. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place you can only reach by a long, winding road. When we arrived, the house looked just as we expected, charming, old-fashioned, with creaky floors and antique furniture. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. We spent the day exploring the area, taking in the fresh air, and enjoying the solitude. By dusk, we were back inside, sitting around the large fireplace, talking and laughing. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house changed. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air, the fire flickering, and then, the sound started. At first, it was just creaking, a few odd noises from the floorboards above us. I didn't think much of it. Old houses are known for settling. But, as the evening wore on, the noises grew more distinct. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing across the floor above us. I looked at my friends. They were all chatting, oblivious. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I stayed quiet, trying to convince myself that it was just the house. But the footsteps didn't stop. They went on for minutes, circling the room above, like someone was pacing around up there. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up, telling my friends I was going to check upstairs. They laughed it off, assuming it was just the wind or the house settling. But as I made my way up the narrow stairs, my heart pounded harder with every step. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. When I reached the top of the stairs, the house was silent. To silent, I moved down the hallway, checking each room, but there was no one there. No sign of any movement, just the eerie silence of the old house. I thought I was being paranoid, but as I turned to head back to the stairs, I saw it. A door, slightly ajar, at the far end of the hallway. It hadn't been open when I first came upstairs. I froze. The footsteps, the creaking, all made sense now. Something or someone had been up here. My breath hitched as I approached the door. I reached out to push it open, and just as my fingers touched the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I staggered back, nearly falling down the stairs in shock. I ran downstairs, shaking, and told my friends what happened. They didn't believe me, of course. They joked about it, but something in my gut told me we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the walls made me jump. I stayed awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it, a soft knock on my bedroom door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The knock came again, louder this time. I slowly rose from the bed and approached the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a whisper, "Let me in." I froze. The voice was unmistakable, a low, raspy whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill straight through me. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away and huddled in the corner of the room, my heart racing. The knock came again, followed by the whisper, now louder and more insistent. "Let me in." I must have stayed in that corner for hours, too terrified to move, until the sun finally rose. When morning came, I thought it was over. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when I went to check the door, it was ajar, just like the one upstairs the night before. I didn't say anything to my friends. They were still asleep, oblivious to what had happened. But, as we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange. A small, almost unnoticeable handprint on the doorframe, tiny, but clear enough to make my stomach churn. We left that morning, never speaking of what happened. I still don't know what it was, but every time I close my eyes, I hear that whisper in my ear, "Let me in." I never believed in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, things that go bump in the night. They were all just stories. But that weekend in the cabin changed everything. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing getaway. A few friends and I rented an old cabin up in the woods, far from civilization. No cell service, no distractions, just a few days to unwind. We arrived just before sunset, the cabin looking exactly like you'd expect from a secluded retreat, small, rustic, and surrounded by dense forest. That night, we gathered around the fireplace, sipping drinks and chatting. The place felt cozy, warm even. But as the evening went on, something felt off. The air grew heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Every now and then, we heard faint knocks on the windows, but when we checked, there was nothing there. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the wind. But then, when we were heading to bed, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement was ajar. I could have sworn we'd closed it earlier. I mentioned it to the group, but they shrugged it off. We were all tired, and the subject was dropped. The night was quiet at first. But then, around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking at the door. I lay there frozen, listening. The knock stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, but it didn't stop the creeping dread in the pit of my stomach. Around 3 a.m., the tapping returned, this time louder, more insistent. Then came a low voice, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill down my spine. It whispered my name, "Let me in." I sat up in bed, heart racing. My mind raced to explain it away. Maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke. But when I looked around, everyone was sound asleep. I didn't move. I couldn't. The air in the room felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. The voice came again, louder this time, "Let me in." The door to my room creaked as if something was gently pushing against it. I wanted to scream, to wake up my friends, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like whatever was outside could hear my every breath, my every movement. I didn't dare make a sound. The door suddenly burst open with a loud bang, and I froze. But there was nothing there, no person, no figure. Just the dark, empty hallway. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs shake as I got out of bed. I crept toward the door, my every instinct telling me to run, but I had to know what was going on. I stepped into the hallway, and as I looked down at the basement door, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The door was now wide open. I knew I had closed it earlier. There was no way it had been left open. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly made my way down the stairs, my heart thudding in my chest. The basement was cold, unnaturally cold. I shone my light around, scanning the dark corners, the old shelves, the dusty floor. Then, in the farthest corner, I saw it, a mirror. Old, cracked, with a thick layer of dust covering it. But it wasn't the mirror that made my blood run cold, it was the reflection. I saw myself standing there, flashlight in hand, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My face was twisted, eyes hollow, grinning in a way I never would. It was like looking at a version of myself that wasn't human. I stepped back in shock, tripping over a box behind me. As I fell, I turned around to find the mirror was gone, vanished, just like that. I ran back upstairs, shaking with fear. When I reached the top of the stairs, the knocking on the door started again, louder, more frantic, and the voice whispering my name again, calling to me. "Let me in." I didn't want to go near the door. I didn't want to even look at it, but somehow, I found myself at the door. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. There was no one there. Just empty air, the hallway stretching before me. But that's when I noticed that the mirror. It was in the hallway now, standing in front of my bedroom door. And as I stared into the reflection, I realized with horror the twisted version of myself was still there, smiling back at me. I never thought I'd be one to experience something unexplainable. My friends and I were always practical, skeptical, but one weekend trip, far out in the woods, changed everything. We rented a small, isolated cabin. The kind you see in movies where people go to get away, only to encounter the supernatural. I figured it would be peaceful, a quiet place to drink, relax, and forget about the world. We arrived at sunset, the cabin surrounded by trees, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the porch. The inside was rustic wooden floors, old furniture, The smell of pine lingered in the air. It felt cozy enough, and we spent the evening unpacking and talking. As night fell, a chill settled in. We gathered around the fire inside, laughing and joking about ghost stories, trying to keep the mood light. But then the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I dismissed it as a typical storm, but my friend Jack seemed unnerved. He kept glancing nervously at the door. "I think something's out there," he muttered, but we all laughed it off. We turned in for the night around midnight. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. The air was unusually cold, but I chalked it up to the old cabin. As I lay in bed, I heard the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, like nails scraping wood. My heart raced. I told myself it was the wind or an animal outside. But then came the sound I couldn't ignore, a tap. Light but distinct, on my door. My blood ran cold. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The wind outside had died down, and all that was left was the eerie silence. I decided to check the hallway. Slowly, I opened my door and crept into the dark corridor. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the house was otherwise still. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated. The downstairs was quiet, but there was a faint light coming from the living room. Someone was downstairs. I didn't want to go down, but I had to. Something felt wrong. I tiptoed down the stairs, every step echoing in the empty cabin. As I rounded the corner into the living room, I froze. The fire had gone out, but the room was lit by someone standing near the window. It was a figure, pale and unmoving, staring out into the night. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then, without warning, it turned to face me. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, a mass of blackness that seemed to absorb the light. No face, just a vague outline. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there, watching me. My heart thudded in my chest. I stepped back, my foot catching the edge of the coffee table. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react, but the air grew colder, the silence heavier. I bolted upstairs and slammed my door shut. The entire night, I lay wide awake, heart racing, listening for any sound, but nothing came. No more knocks, no more scraping, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears. The next morning, I didn't want to mention it to my friends. I figured they'd think I was imagining things. But when we all gathered in the kitchen, I saw that Jack looked as pale as I felt. "I heard something last night," he said, voice trembling. "Someone was knocking at my window, and ... I saw something out there, a figure." My stomach twisted. Everyone shared their experiences, and it was clear none of us had slept well. I suggested we leave early, but no one wanted to drive back through the dark woods just yet. So, we decided to stay for one more night. That evening, we stayed inside. None of us wanted to go outside or even near the windows. We ate dinner in silence, the tension thick in the air. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for us. Around midnight, we heard the knocking. It started faint, then grew louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the walls. Everyone froze. The sound was relentless, rhythmic, like it was searching for a way in. Then, there was a voice, low and hoarse. "Let me in." It was unmistakable. We bolted out of the cabin and into the car, not even bothering to pack our things. As we drove away, I glanced back through the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, dark and silent except for the faint, flickering light from the upstairs window. Months later, I looked up the cabin online. The description said it was recently renovated, but the listing had been taken down. I found a local news article from the 1980s about a family that had gone missing near the cabin. They had been staying in a cabin just like ours, but the article never explained what happened to them. It didn't say they were found. I don't know what was in that cabin with us, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of the knocking on the walls, and the voice that wasn't human. Something was in there, and it had been waiting for us to arrive. I've always loved old houses, the creaking floors, the smell of dust and history. It all felt comforting to me. So, when a friend of mine offered me a weekend stay in a remote house she had recently inherited, I jumped at the chance. It was an isolated 2-story place, surrounded by thick woods, and from the moment I arrived, Something about it felt off. The first night, I felt fine. My friend had warned me about the odd noises, saying it was just an old house settling, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't heard anything normal. Every creak, every faint whisper in the walls made my skin crawl. I brushed it off. It was just the house settling, right. That night, I decided to sleep on the couch downstairs. The upstairs felt too isolated, too empty. I tried to make myself comfortable, wrapping myself in a blanket as the night grew colder. The wind outside howled, but it didn't bother me much. I'd always liked the sound of a storm. At around 3 a.m., I was woken by a strange noise. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. My heart skipped. I knew no one was supposed to be here with me. I stood up, thinking maybe my friend had come down for something, but when I peeked upstairs, the hall was empty. I stood frozen, trying to decide whether I should go back to sleep or investigate. The footsteps grew louder. They were now coming down the stairs. I froze, not daring to move. The stairs creaked with each step. 1, 2, 3. I could hear the weight of each footfall, as if someone was walking slowly down toward me. But when I looked, no one was there. My pulse quickened. I looked over at the staircase, feeling an overwhelming urge to check. Slowly, I stood and made my way to the foot of the stairs. The air had gotten colder, almost icy, but nothing was there. No one was coming down. Relieved, I laughed to myself, thinking it must have been my mind playing tricks. I walked back to the couch, but as I sat down, the unmistakable sound of breathing reached my ears. It was slow, steady, but coming from right behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone there. But nothing. The room was empty. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my head was spinning. Maybe it was just my nerves and overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I got up and locked all the doors. I even pushed a chair under the doorknob for good measure. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't pinpoint why. When I checked the windows, everything outside was dark, still. No movement, just the wind. Around 4 a.m., I decided to leave the house. I didn't feel safe there anymore, but as I grabbed my bag, something caught my eye in the hallway mirror. It was my reflection only. It wasn't quite right. I stared at the mirror, confused. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't smiling. I backed away from the mirror, my pulse racing, but when I looked back, it was gone. The smile was gone, and the reflection seemed normal again. I grabbed my things and ran out of the house, not looking back until I was safely in my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still in there, watching me. The next morning, I got a message from my friend. It was a simple text. "Did you hear anything last night?" I texted her back, asking what she meant. Her response sent a chill down my spine. "I forgot to tell you there's a family who used to live there. They all died in a fire in the house years ago. People say their spirits are trapped in the walls, still walking around, still breathing." I felt my stomach drop. What did I see in that mirror? Was it one of them? Had they been there all along, waiting for someone to notice? The last thing she wrote haunted me long after I left. The weird thing is, sometimes people leave that house, but they never seem to fully leave. The spirits follow them, always. Now, months later, I still don't sleep well. And sometimes, when I glance at a mirror, I swear I see a faint, twisted smile in the reflection, someone, or something, just behind me. But when I turn around, nothing is there, and I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting to follow me again. A few years ago, I went on a weekend getaway with some friends to a cabin deep in the woods. It was meant to be a relaxing retreat from the chaos of our daily lives. The place was remote, no cell service, no distractions, just a small, rustic cabin and the forest surrounding us. My friends were all excited, but I had a strange feeling as soon as we arrived. The cabin was old, the kind of place that creaked and groaned in the night, but the air felt thick, like it was holding something back. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking it was just nerves, but something wasn't right. We spent the day hiking and chatting around the campfire. The evening came, and we all gathered in the cabin, laughing and drinking. But around midnight, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy and quiet to quiet. No crickets, no breeze, just silence. I was sitting near the window when I noticed it, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the trees moving in the wind, but when I looked closer, I saw that it was still. And then it moved. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the shadow was definitely there. It was a figure standing just outside the window, barely visible in the dark. My heart jumped, and I quickly looked away, trying to shake off the unease. But I couldn't. The others were oblivious, caught up in their conversation. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I heard a soft tap on the window. I froze. My friends continued talking, unaware, but the tap came again. Faint, slow, as if someone was gently knocking on the glass. I jumped up and pulled the curtains shut, my breath shallow. The others glanced at me, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound crazy. The tapping stopped after a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I tried to relax and join the conversation, but the quiet around the cabin was unsettling. Every now and then, I thought I heard something: footsteps, twigs breaking, soft whispers in the distance. I kept glancing out the window, but the darkness held nothing but the looming trees. When we decided to head to bed, I couldn't sleep. The sounds outside the cabin had grown louder. It was as if something was pacing around the house. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But then there was a knock, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the ceiling. My heart nearly stopped. The knock echoed through the cabin, like something or someone was in the attic. I had to check. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The knocking continued, methodical, like it was trying to get my attention. I gathered all the courage I had and crept up the stairs to the attic. The air was colder, and I could feel my skin prickle with every step. The door to the attic was ajar, just slightly. I slowly pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside was a dusty, empty space. But there, on the floor, was something that shouldn't have been there: a footprint. A muddy, human-sized footprint. I quickly stepped back and slammed the door shut. I couldn't explain it. I went back to my room and locked the door, not daring to go outside or tell anyone. It wasn't until the next morning that I told my friends about the sounds. They were skeptical at first, but then we checked the attic. There were more footprints, all around the space. They didn't look like they'd been there long, like someone had been walking around up there, moving things. We immediately decided to leave. We packed up and drove back to town. But as we were leaving the property, something made my blood run cold. The window. The same window where I'd seen the figure earlier. It was wide open. The lock was still in place, but the window had been opened from the inside. I can't explain it. The cabin was supposed to be empty when we arrived. There were no signs of anyone having been there before. But someone or something had been watching us the entire time, lurking just out of sight, waiting. We never went back to that cabin. I still have nightmares about the knocking, the footsteps, and that damn window. But the worst part, I still don't know who or what had been in that attic. The only thing I'm sure of is that it wasn't human. We weren't the type to go to haunted places. It wasn't that we didn't believe in ghosts. It was just that none of us wanted to test it out. But when we saw the ad for a weekend getaway at a supposedly haunted house, we thought it would be fun. Just a harmless thrill, a way to break up the monotony. The house was old, much older than we expected. The kind of place where the floorboards creaked under every step and the air smelled faintly of mildew. We arrived late on a Friday evening, the sun already down, and the house seemed to greet us with an eerie silence. The first few hours were fine. We joked about the house's creepy reputation, settled into our rooms, and started a game of cards in the living room. But, as the night wore on, things started to feel off. Around midnight, we heard it. A thudding noise coming from the upstairs. It was faint at first, like footsteps, but the sound grew louder. There was no one else in the house, no one but us. We all paused, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time running down the hallway. I was ready to laugh it off, but something stopped me. It was too deliberate. I suggested we check it out. My friends hesitated, but curiosity got the best of them. We tiptoed up the stairs, our hearts pounding in our chests. The hallway upstairs was dark, but we could see the door to one of the rooms open a crack, just enough to feel like something was watching us. Then the thud came again, closer this time. It was coming from the open room. We didn't dare move. The noise stopped. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, frozen. And then, a voice, faint and raspy, came from the room. "Leave." The sound sent a chill down my spine. We all backed away, but then the door slammed shut by itself, as if something inside didn't want us near. I don't think any of us slept that night. The air was too thick with unease. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, felt like it was watching us. We could hear whispers from the other rooms, distant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Morning came, but the strange feelings didn't go away. We tried to forget about it, to shrug it off as just a prank or our imagination running wild, but something about that place still unsettled us. After breakfast, we decided to explore the house. We went into the attic, hoping to find something to distract us. The stairs creaked under our feet as we made our way up. The attic was dusty, filled with old furniture and boxes, but there was something strange about the far corner. A large mirror, covered in dust, stood there, reflecting only the dim light from our flashlights. We wiped the dust off and stared into it. The reflection was odd, fuzzy, blurry, like the mirror couldn't quite capture the room right. Then it shifted. For a brief moment, it looked like the room behind us wasn't the attic at all. It was a hallway, with the same door we'd seen earlier, the one that slammed shut. But it wasn't just that. There was something else in the reflection, standing in the hallway. A figure, a man, tall and thin, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. His face was obscured, but his posture was unnerving, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though he was staring directly at us. I gasped and turned around. There was nothing behind us, just the dusty attic. We all felt it, then a cold wave of dread. The temperature in the room dropped, and the whispers returned, now louder, more urgent. We didn't waste any time. We hurried down the stairs and out of the house, our nerves frayed, but as we were leaving, something caught my eye. It was a small piece of paper tucked under the door. I picked it up, feeling a strange sensation in my fingers as I unfolded it. The message was simple, written in jagged handwriting. "Don't look in the mirror." I nearly dropped it. My hands shook as I showed it to the others. We all stared at each other, too terrified to speak. We didn't stay another minute. We packed up and left, not daring to look back. The drive home was quiet, everyone too shaken to talk. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I froze. For a brief second, I saw the same reflection in the glass, the tall figure, standing behind me, its face still hidden. The figure was in the mirror again. But this time, it wasn't the old house, it was our car, and the figure was standing just inches from my seat. That's when I realized. It wasn't just the house that was haunted. It had followed us. A few friends, a remote location, and no distractions, just the way we wanted it. The cabin was a little older than we expected, but it had character. We arrived just before sunset and spent the evening laughing around the fire pit, exchanging old stories. The atmosphere felt peaceful. But as the sun set, a strange quiet settled in, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. I chalked it up to the isolation, but a creeping sense of unease grew as the night wore on. We retired to our rooms after a while. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway, and I felt an odd tension the moment I closed the door behind me. The sounds from the house were creaking. The wind outside were expected, but then I started hearing something else, a tapping. Faint at first, like someone knocking softly on the door, followed by a dragging noise. I froze, heart pounding. I was certain it wasn't the wind. I lay still, trying to listen. Another tap. Then something that sounded like fingernails scraping against the door frame. My skin prickled. I had to get up, but I didn't want to. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling. The noise stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was over. But just as I thought I might be able to sleep, there came a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "Let me in." I nearly screamed. The voice sounded too close, like it was coming from just outside my door. It wasn't a prank. I knew that much. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I sat against the door, every part of me screaming to run. I glanced around the room, searching for something to use as a weapon. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, I don't know. Eventually, the knocking stopped, the voice didn't return. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found my friends already downstairs. They were chatting, completely unaware of the events from the night before. I didn't mention it, who would believe me? Instead, we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to forget the oppressive silence that had followed us all night. Later that evening, we sat around the fireplace again, talking casually, but the nagging feeling returned. The wind outside was picking up again, howling through the trees. As we chatted, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the door frame. I hadn't seen them before. But there they were, deep. Jagged gouges like something had been clawing at the door. I tried to shake it off, but as the night went on, the air grew thicker, colder. Then, at exactly midnight, a sudden loud bang shook the cabin. My heart stopped. It sounded like something or someone had struck the door with force. We all froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, stood up slowly. "I'll check it out," he said. We didn't stop him. It was stupid, but in the moment, we were all too frozen to act. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and looked around. There was nothing there, no one, just an empty corridor. He turned to look back at us, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said quietly, confused. We all moved into the hallway to see what he was talking about. The door frame was covered in fresh, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the door was a handprint. It was smeared in something dark, something that didn't belong. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't paint. It looked like blood. None of us said anything at first. The air felt heavy. I glanced down the hallway, my blood running cold. The door to the attic, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Without thinking, I moved towards it, my steps slow and hesitant. We had to know what was happening. The others followed me, but no one spoke. As I approached the attic stairs, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of someone breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, from inside the attic. I turned to the others, and Mark motioned for us to stay quiet. He approached the stairs and slowly reached for the light switch. The attic light flickered on. We waited, breath held, as the shadows parted to reveal an empty room, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a full-length mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. Standing behind us, reflected in the glass, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. A pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, but no one else saw her. In the room. Just in the mirror. Suddenly, the house seemed to shudder as if it had come alive. The mirror cracked, and then everything went black. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, hearts still pounding, and we never spoke of that night again. It started with Adair, my cousin, my best friend, and I were spending the weekend at my uncle's remote cabin in the woods. The cabin was old and creaky, surrounded by dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. My uncle had warned us not to go near the abandoned well out back. He said it was unsafe, but the way he avoided talking about it made it sound like there was more to the story. Naturally, that made it the most interesting thing about the place. After a day of hiking and exploring, the conversation drifted back to the well. My cousin, ever the instigator, dared me to go out there at night and knock on the stones. I tried to laugh it off, but the teasing started. They called me a chicken, and that was all it took. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped into my boots, and made my way toward the well, my friends trailing behind to ensure I didn't back out. The well was in worse shape than I expected. The stones were slick with moss, and weeds grew wild around its base. The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the blackness below, revealing only damp, ancient bricks descending into nothingness. My cousin nudged me, urging me to get on with it. I hesitated, then leaned forward and gave the side of the well a solid knock. The sound echoed unnaturally, hollow and metallic, far deeper than I thought possible. It shouldn't have echoed like that. I straightened up, unease creeping in. Just as I was about to turn away, a faint noise drifted up from the darkness below. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it. But then it grew louder. Clearer. It was the sound of someone knocking back. We froze. My cousin laughed nervously, insisting it had to be an echo. But the knocks came again, faster now, more deliberate. It was not an echo. The knocks were uneven, like fingers tapping rhythmically against stone. I turned to leave, but my flashlight caught something near the base of the well. Scratches on the stones, faint but visible, as if someone had clawed at the bricks in desperation. My best friend pointed it out, his voice trembling as he asked if we were sure the well was abandoned. We were all staring at the marks when the knocking stopped, replaced by a new sound. A voice, faint and scratchy, rising from the depths. It didn't sound like a person. It was warped, as if spoken through water, but unmistakably a voice, muttering words we couldn't make out. My cousin grabbed my arm and whispered that it was time to go. We all agreed without hesitation. As we turned to leave, the flashlight flickered, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as I slapped the side of the light, desperate to get it working again. When it finally flickered back to life, the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. A hand, pale and emaciated, was reaching over the edge of the well. I screamed, and we bolted for the cabin, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. We didn't stop until we were inside, locking the door behind us. My uncle wasn't due back until the next day, and none of us wanted to be the one to suggest going outside again to check. We tried to calm ourselves down, convincing each other it had to be a trick of the light or our imaginations. Still, none of us slept that night. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind had us on edge. In the morning, sunlight brought a fragile sense of normalcy. We ventured back to the well in the safety of daylight, determined to prove it was just our minds playing tricks on us. The scratches were still there, as vivid as ever, but there was no sign of the hand or anything else unusual. But then we noticed something chilling. The moss on the stones had been disturbed, long streaks dragged toward the top of the well, as if something had been climbing out. And at the base of the well, leading into the woods, were fresh footprints in the mud. Bare human footprints. It started as a simple road trip. My friends and I had planned to drive through some scenic back roads, far from the city, to escape the monotony of daily life. There were 4 of us in total, packed into a single car, with snacks and playlists ready to fill the hours. The air was filled with laughter, the kind that comes easily when you're surrounded by people who know you best. As evening fell, we realized we had underestimated the distance between stops. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and we hadn't seen another car or building in hours. The GPS signal had dropped, leaving us navigating by instinct and the dim headlights. The road narrowed, lined by towering trees that seemed to close in on us the further we drove. When we finally spotted an old gas station, the relief in the car was palpable. The gas station looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The sign was rusted, and the single pump looked ancient. But the lights inside the small convenience store were on, casting a weak yellow glow into the darkness. One of my friends, let's call him Alex, volunteered to check it out while we stayed behind to stretch our legs. We watched Alex disappear through the door, the light swallowing him up. The air outside was cold, and an unsettling quiet settled over the area. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. I glanced at the trees, their shadows shifting unnaturally in the dim light of the car's headlights. Alex returned a few minutes later, looking uneasy. He said there was a man behind the counter who hadn't spoken a word, just stared at him while he paid for the gas. He'd filled up the tank already. So, we piled back into the car, eager to leave. As we drove away, I glanced back at the gas station. The man Alex mentioned was standing in the doorway, watching us. His face was pale, almost skeletal, and his eyes seemed to reflect the headlights like an animal's. I turned back around, heart pounding, but I didn't say anything. The road ahead became even narrower, and the trees seemed thicker, their branches hanging low as if trying to trap us. The mood in the car shifted from lighthearted to tense as we drove deeper into the forest. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving us in complete darkness. We sat in silence for a moment, the realization sinking in that we were stranded. Alex tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. The only sound was the soft creak of the cooling engine. We were debating whether to wait or start walking when we heard it aloud. Deliberate knock on the car window. It came from my side. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. My friend in the back seat swore she saw something moving just outside her window, but when we all looked, the forest was still. We locked the doors, our breath shallow, hearts racing. Then came the knock again, this time on the rear window. Louder, more forceful. Something scraped along the side of the car, a long, drawn-out sound like nails on metal. We sat frozen, staring into the darkness, when the knocking started again. It moved from window to window, rhythmic and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was circling us. Suddenly, the car's interior lights flickered on, bathing us in harsh yellow light. That's when we saw it, a face pressed against the driver's side window, pale and hollow-eyed, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Before any of us could scream, the lights flickered again and went out, leaving us in darkness once more. The knocking stopped. We sat in silence, too scared to move or speak, when the car engine roared to life on its own. The headlights blazed back on, illuminating the road ahead. Without hesitation, Alex slammed on the gas, and we sped down the narrow road. None of us dared to look back. We didn't stop until we reached a town several miles away. When we pulled into a well-lit gas station, the relief was overwhelming. We climbed out of the car, still shaken, and that's when we saw it. Long scratches ran down the length of the car, deep grooves carved into the metal. At the back of the car, smeared in what looked like ash, were handprints. Too large to be human. We never figured out what happened that night. We didn't report it. Who would believe us? But every time I drive through a wooded area, I catch myself glancing into the trees, expecting to see that pale face watching, waiting. And sometimes, just for a split second, I swear I do. We didn't plan to stop at the roadside motel. It was one of those last-minute decisions made out of desperation, a mix of exhaustion and heavy rain forcing us off the highway. The building was old and run down, the kind of place that made you second-guess walking in, but we were too tired to care. The lobby smelled faintly of mildew, and the clerk behind the desk barely acknowledged us as he handed over the key to room 3. It wasn't much to look at: a small room with peeling wallpaper, a single queen bed, and a flickering light bulb in the corner. There was a heavy stillness about the place, like time had forgotten it. My friend Ellie joked that it looked like the perfect setting for a horror movie. We both laughed, but it didn't ease the unease I felt creeping up my spine. We set our bags down and decided to freshen up. I went to the bathroom first, leaving Ellie to unpack. The bathroom was cramped and dingy, the mirror cloudy with streaks that refused to wipe away. I washed my face quickly, trying not to linger. When I came out, Ellie was standing by the window, staring at the parking lot below. "Did you see that?" she asked without looking at me. "See what?" I moved to the window, peering out into the rain-soaked lot. There was nothing there but our car and a few others, their windows fogged from the downpour. Ellie shook her head. "I thought I saw someone standing by the lamppost, just staring up at us. I didn't see anything," and I told her as much, though my voice wavered. Ellie shrugged it off, but she stayed quiet after that, sitting cross-legged on the bed while scrolling through her phone. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, but I couldn't shake the heavy feeling in the air. A loud knock broke the silence. We both jumped, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. I glanced at Ellie, and she shrugged. She didn't seem eager to answer it either. Finally, I mustered the courage to approach the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the narrow corridor. It was completely silent except for the hum of the rain outside. I called out, but no one answered. My nerves felt raw as I quickly shut and locked the door behind me. "What was it?" Ellie asked. "No one. Probably some kids messing around," I replied, trying to convince myself as much as her. She nodded, but neither of us relaxed after that. We decided to watch some TV to distract ourselves, flipping through static-filled channels until we found a fuzzy soap opera. The noise was comforting, but I still felt like we were being watched. At one point, Ellie got up to grab a drink from the mini fridge, but she froze halfway there. "What is that?" she whispered, pointing to the corner of the room. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, on the wall near the ceiling, was a dark handprint. It looked like it had been dragged downward, smearing black streaks as it went. It hadn't been there when we first came in. We stared at it in stunned silence before Ellie scrambled to grab her phone and take a picture. The flash illuminated the room briefly, and when the photo appeared on her screen, I felt my blood run cold. In the picture, there was a face reflected in the window behind us, pale, hollow-eyed, and staring directly at us. We spun around, our eyes darting to the window, but there was no one there. Just the rain. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing our bags without waiting for her to respond. Ellie didn't argue. She was already pulling on her jacket, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. We bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind us, and didn't stop until we were in the car, engine running, speeding back onto the highway. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. It wasn't until we were miles away that Ellie broke the silence. "The picture," she said quietly, unlocking her phone and opening the photo. Her face went pale. She handed it to me without saying a word, and when I looked, my heart stopped. The face in the window wasn't hollow-eyed anymore. It was smiling. I was working the night shift as a park ranger, a job I had loved since I began. It was late October, and the forest had a magical quality about it, with the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold. That night, the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. I had just finished checking the trails and was preparing to return to the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. A voice emerged, shaky and frightened. It was a family camping about a mile deep in the woods. They said they heard something outside their tent, something big that had been pacing around for hours. I could hear the panic in the father's voice, urging me to come quickly. I reassured him, telling him it was probably just a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down the winding path, hoping to ease their fears. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced with the rustling leaves. As I moved deeper into the woods, I felt a chill run down my spine. The sound of my boots crunching on fallen twigs was the only noise accompanying me. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and I called out to the family as I approached their campsite. The tent stood eerily still, the only movement coming from the wind tugging at the flaps. My heart raced as I called out again, but there was no response. The father had promised they would be awake, but it was as if the night had swallowed them whole. I stepped closer and noticed the tent zipper was slightly open. Something was off. I cautiously unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags lay sprawled across the ground, still warm, but there was no sign of the family. Panic surged through me as I stepped back and scanned the area. That's when I heard a low growl emanating from the trees. It was not an animal's growl. It sounded human, guttural and strained. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, heart pounding as I caught a glimpse of something moving behind the trees. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the shadows. It looked like a man, but was far too thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. It didn't walk. It glided toward me, its eyes reflecting the light like two coals burning in the night. I stumbled backward, fear gripping me as it stepped closer. I spun around and bolted back down the path, adrenaline surging through my veins. The growl grew louder, now accompanied by footsteps that echoed behind me. I dashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. I dared not look back, focusing instead on the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness ahead. As I neared the main trail, I could feel the figure closing in. My heart raced, each beat pounding in my ears. I burst onto the main road, my breath ragged. Just as I thought I was safe, I tripped over a tree root and fell hard onto the dirt, the flashlight skidding away from my grasp. The growl was deafening now, a horrible cacophony of rage and desperation. I scrambled to my feet and reached for the flashlight, but as my fingers closed around the cool metal, I felt a hot breath on my neck. I froze, terror coursing through my body. With a sudden rush of instinct, I turned and swung the flashlight behind me, shining the beam into the face of my pursuer. But it wasn't the terrifying creature I expected. Instead, it was a deer doe with big, frightened eyes. It stood frozen, staring at me, seemingly just as scared as I was. I stood there, bewildered, the growling sound fading into the night. It dawned on me that the family had probably packed up and left in fear. I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts, glancing around. There were no signs of the creature, just the rustling leaves and the gentle sway of the trees. When I made my way back to the ranger station, I realized that sometimes our minds can conjure the most terrifying monsters. In the stillness of the woods, fear had twisted my perception of reality. The shadows played tricks on me, and the fears of the night had become a tangible monster. Yet, as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Something lurked beyond the trees, just out of sight, reminding me that the dark holds more than just the fear of what we see. It also contains the shadows of our imagination. I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. Most nights are quiet, but there was one night that has haunted me ever since. It was mid-October, the air crisp and heavy with the scent of pine. I was on a routine patrol when the eerie stillness settled over the forest. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle and your heart race. Around 8 p.m., I got a call over the radio. A family camping nearby reported strange noises coming from the woods. The father described them as high-pitched screeches followed by low growls. Unlike anything they had ever heard, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I told them I would check it out, trying to keep my voice steady. As I hiked toward their campsite, the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows deepened, swallowing the light from my flashlight. I could hear the wind rustling through the branches, but there was something else, a low thudding sound echoing in the distance. It felt unnatural, rhythmic, almost as if something was moving through the trees. When I finally reached the campsite, it was eerily quiet. The family's tent stood dark and still, the flickering light of their campfire casting long shadows on the ground. I called out to them, but received no reply. A knot formed in my stomach as I unzipped the tent. Inside, their belongings were scattered, but the family was gone. Their sleeping bags lay untouched, and I noticed a half-eaten bag of marshmallows abandoned by the fire. Then I heard it again, the thudding sound, now closer and more urgent. Panic surged through me. I stepped out of the tent, gripping my flashlight tightly. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to writhe, almost alive. I swept the light around, searching for any sign of the family. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, its shape distorted and unnatural. It looked humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head oddly shaped. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The creature turned its head toward me, revealing eyes that glowed like embers. I stumbled back, fear clawing at my throat. The creature let out a shriek that pierced the night, a sound that sent chills racing down my spine. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I could hear the thudding sound behind me, getting closer with each step. The adrenaline surged through me as I pushed myself harder. Just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, I burst onto the main trail where I had parked my truck. I fumbled for the radio, breathless as I called for backup. I needed help. I needed to find that family. After what felt like an eternity, another ranger arrived. A flashlight in hand, we retraced my steps back to the campsite, but the creature was gone. I explained everything to my fellow ranger, and we searched the area thoroughly. The family was still missing. Just as we were about to give up, I noticed something unusual. A set of footprints leading away from the campsite. Deep imprints in the soft ground that looked far too large to belong to any human. I followed the prints, my heart racing again. They led deeper into the woods, away from the main trails. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above us. After several minutes of walking, we found ourselves in a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, with its trunk gnarled and twisted, and at the base of that tree lay the family's belongings: hiking boots, a backpack, and even a stuffed animal. But there was no sign of them. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, I heard a soft whimper. I turned to see the ranger beside me, his face pale and ashen. Then it happened. The ground beneath us shifted, and the massive tree creaked ominously. I stumbled back as I realized the truth. The tree wasn't just a tree, it was a trap, a living thing. The roots twisted and curled, reaching out like fingers, searching for more. Suddenly, the tree shuddered violently, and I was knocked to the ground. The ranger shouted, but the sound was drowned out by a deafening roar that shook the earth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, never looking back. The next morning, the search teams found the family unharmed, wandering near the edge of the woods, unaware of what had transpired. They insisted they had only gone for a short walk and had become disoriented in the darkness. The ranger and I tried to explain, but no one believed us. They had returned unscathed, but I knew what lurked beneath the surface of those woods. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. I never expected my job as a park ranger to take such a terrifying turn. It was mid-autumn, and I was patrolling the deep woods that had grown dark and ominous with the season. The air was crisp, leaves crunched beneath my boots, and the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting eerie shadows among the trees. I was on my usual route, ensuring the trails were clear for any late-season campers. Around dusk, I received a call from a group of campers who reported strange noises near their campsite. They described it as a low growl mixed with something like human whispers. At first, I thought it might be a bear or perhaps the wind playing tricks on them, but their fear was palpable over the radio. I decided to head out and check on them. As I made my way through the thickening underbrush, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as nerves. After all, I had patrolled these woods countless times. I reached their campsite just as twilight faded into night. The fire was dying down, and the campers huddled around it, wide-eyed and trembling. They explained that the sounds had started shortly after sunset, echoing from the tree line. They insisted it felt like something was lurking just out of sight. I tried to calm them, suggesting it was probably just wildlife. But, as we sat around the fire, the noises began again, a low growl followed by the faintest of whispers that seemed to slither through the air. "Did you hear that?" One of the campers gasped. I nodded, my heart racing. This was more than just wildlife. I instructed everyone to stay close and keep the fire burning. As I scanned the perimeter of the clearing, the shadows began to twist and writhe in a way that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the bushes to my left. I swung my flashlight toward it, and in the beam, I caught a glimpse of something pale and elongated, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, but the campers had seen it too. "I don't like this," one of them said, his voice trembling. "We should leave," I agreed. It felt wrong to stay any longer. As we packed up, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a chilling wind. I kept the flashlight aimed into the dark as we walked, trying to ignore the sensations of dread gnawing at me. As we reached the trail, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. I turned, but nothing was there. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I quickened my pace, urging the campers to do the same. The whispers intensified, echoing our fears, the sound growing nearer. Just then, a loud crack echoed through the trees, and we all jumped. I turned around to face the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. A figure stood a few yards away, its features distorted in the dim light. It had unnaturally long limbs, and its eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The whispers transformed into guttural sounds, incomprehensible but undeniably threatening. Instinct kicked in, and I shouted for everyone to run. We sprinted down the trail, hearts pounding in our chests, the sounds of our panicked breaths mixing with the monstrous growls behind us. We pushed through the thick underbrush, desperate to put distance between us and whatever was chasing us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon a clearing that opened up to the main road. We dashed across, collapsing in a heap on the other side. The woods loomed behind us, dark and silent. The terror suddenly stilled. As we caught our breath, I looked at the campers, trying to reassure them that we were safe now. But then, one of them pointed back toward the woods. My stomach dropped. Emerging from the tree line was not the figure we had encountered, but a group of people in costumes, their faces painted and eyes wide with laughter. It was a Halloween prank gone awry. They had been planning a haunted trail and didn't realize they had scared us off. The whispers we heard were merely their attempts to build suspense. The growls, just a well-placed speaker hidden in the bushes. I felt a mix of relief and annoyance wash over me. We were safe, but the realization left me feeling foolish. Yet even as they explained their prank, I couldn't shake the lingering feeling of dread. As I turned back toward the woods, the air felt different, heavier. I saw the shadows shift again, but this time I noticed something more unsettling. In the distance, not far from where the pranksters had emerged, the real figure stood, watching us with those glowing eyes. We had planned this camping trip for weeks. our usual way to unwind before winter set in. Yena, Matt, Aaron, and I packed our tents and sleeping bags, and I'd brought a little extra something, a stash of magic mushrooms to enhance the night. We were miles away from any marked trails, deep in the woods where only the sounds of nature kept us company. We set up camp by dusk, got a fire going, and started our little journey with the mushrooms, watching as the trees seemed to breathe and the stars felt close enough to touch Dot as the fire crackled and shadows danced. Yena suggested we take a walk through the forest. She grinned, saying it'd be creepy, and since we were all a bit out of our minds, it sounded like the perfect idea. We grabbed our flashlights, but something about the inky darkness seemed to swallow the light. Everything felt surreal, as if we'd stumbled into another world. We laughed and whispered as we moved deeper into the trees. But then, from somewhere nearby, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the rhythmic clanking of chains. The sound was distant but getting louder, moving closer. We froze, listening as the noise grew. And then, through the trees, a glow appeared, small pinpoints of light, steadily moving in our direction. Panicked, we ducked into the nearest bushes, crouching low as we peered out to see what was coming. My heart hammered in my chest, and every instinct screamed to run, but we were too mesmerized by the sight to move. Emerging through the trees, a procession of figures marched forward, each one draped in chains that rattled with every step. They wore white masks that covered their faces completely, expressionless and pale, giving no clue who or what was behind them. There were at least 10 of them, each holding a lantern that cast an eerie glow across their forms. The orange light flickered, illuminating shackles on their wrists and ankles, the chains connecting them to each other. Their movements were mechanical, precise, as if they'd been marching for centuries without a break. We held our breath, too terrified to even think about making a sound. The figures walked in eerie silence except for the relentless clanking of chains, heading right past our hiding spot. My pulse raced as one of them turned slightly, his mask facing directly toward our bush. The lantern light caught his empty eyes, and I felt a cold, uncheckable dread sink into my bones. I thought I'd been seen, but he turned away and kept walking. They moved onward, disappearing deeper into the woods, their lights fading until only the sound of chains remained. We waited until we were sure they were gone, and then we sat in silence, no one daring to speak. We stumbled back to the campsite in a daze, still reeling from what we'd seen. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle in the dark made us jolt. We stayed huddled together, barely able to close our eyes as we listened to the forest around us, half expecting those figures to return. At the first light of dawn, we decided it was time to go. As we approached the camp, something felt off. From a distance, we could see the tents were knocked over, and the fire we'd put out the night before was smoldering again, as if it had just been lit. We exchanged uneasy glances and moved cautiously toward the site. There, etched in the dirt next to our fire pit, was a message: "We will find you." The words looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in the ground mere moments before we arrived. None of us said a word. We knew what we had to do. We quickly packed what little was left of our things, each of us keeping a nervous eye on the trees, half expecting one of those masked figures to emerge. We practically sprinted back to the car, the weight of an unseen gaze pressing down on us the entire way. It wasn't until we were back on the road, the forest fading behind us, that anyone spoke, and even then, it was in hushed tones. We never went back to those woods, and we never told anyone else what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the clanking of chains echoing in my mind, and I see that mask staring through the darkness. When I was younger, I spent many weekends camping with friends in the woods. This one particular trip was planned to celebrate the end of summer, just before school started. It was me, my cousin Emily, and our 2 friends, Jake and Sarah. We set up camp in a remote area, far from the busy trails and the noise of the city. The trees were tall and the air smelled of pine, a crispness that reminded us of adventure. After setting up our tents, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories as dusk turned to night. Sarah had brought her guitar, and we strummed out tunes under a star-filled sky. As the night deepened, I felt a strange energy in the air, almost electric, but I shrugged it off as excitement. As the fire crackled, Emily suggested a night hike. The woods were dark and inviting, and fueled by our earlier stories, we decided to go for it. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way into the forest. The moment we stepped off the clearing, the sounds of the night enveloped us. The chirping of crickets was punctuated by the rustle of leaves, a haunting symphony that was both thrilling and unnerving. We walked for what felt like an hour, chatting and laughing, when suddenly a loud rustling came from the bushes nearby. It sounded almost like a growl. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us wondering if we should turn back. Jake, always the brave one, insisted it was probably just a deer. So, we pressed on. As we moved deeper into the woods, we noticed something odd. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking the moonlight and casting eerie shadows that danced just beyond our line of sight. Then came the sound again. This time it was closer and more pronounced, a scraping noise like nails against wood. My heart raced, but curiosity pushed us forward. Just then, we stumbled into a small clearing, illuminated by our flashlights. There, we found an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. It looked abandoned, yet there was a strange feeling that we weren't alone. Despite the unease creeping over us, we approached the cabin, driven by adrenaline and the need for exploration. As we neared the door, I noticed something glimmering in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it and gasped. It was a small, rusty key. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of its history. My friends gathered around, intrigued. We decided to look inside, the thrill of discovery overshadowing our instincts to leave. With some effort, we pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floorboards groaned beneath our feet. As we explored, Sarah suddenly screamed, pointing to the wall. There were strange symbols carved into the wood. Some looked like faces, others like claws reaching out. We stepped back, our hearts racing. Then, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, panic surging as we rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew cold, and a feeling of dread settled in our stomachs. Then, we heard the sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Jake pushed against the door with all his might, and just as it started to budge, the footsteps stopped. We held our breath, the silence almost deafening. We decided to stay quiet, hoping whatever was out there would leave us alone. But then came a low whisper, so soft we could barely hear it. It was unintelligible, but laced with malice, sending chills down my spine. The door rattled as something pressed against it from the outside. Emily, shaking with fear, urged us to find a window. We all scrambled to the nearest one, fumbling with the broken glass, desperate to escape. But before we could get it open, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging us to listen. Suddenly, the key I had found began to glow in my hand. I glanced at my friends, confusion etched on their faces. Without thinking, I ran back to the door, inserting the key into the lock. To my shock, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open as if inviting us to flee. We stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the sounds of whispers fading behind us. We ran back to our camp, our hearts pounding, not daring to look back. When we finally reached the safety of the fire, we collapsed in a heap, shaking with adrenaline and fear. But the night was not over. As we settled down, I noticed the key still clutched in my hand. My stomach dropped as I realized the symbols I had seen in the cabin were now etched into my skin, forming a pattern on my wrist that burned like a brand. We were never meant to leave that cabin, and I could feel something watching us from the darkness, waiting for its time. It was late October when I signed up for a solo shift as a park ranger, patrolling the trails after dark. The deep woods were always eerie at night, but there was something about the fall air that made the trees seem closer, the shadows thicker. I had patrolled the park dozens of times before, but something about that night felt different. My flashlight was weak, its beam barely cutting through the mist that had settled over the forest. The towering pines creaked in the wind as I made my way down one of the less traveled paths. I had heard stories over the years, rumors about strange things happening deep in these woods. Most of the time, it was just old campers telling ghost stories around a fire. I never believed them until that night. As I moved deeper into the woods, I came across an old campsite. The fire pit was cold, and the tent looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There were no signs of wildlife, no rustling of leaves or chirping of insects. The stillness was unnerving. I radioed in to let the others know I had found the site, but there was no response, just static. My heart began to race. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to go further. A thick fog had started to roll in, making it even harder to see. The path twisted and narrowed, and soon I found myself in an area of the park I had never seen before. I didn't recognize any of the landmarks. I checked my map and compass, but neither seemed to make sense. The compass needle spun wildly, as if it were confused, and the map didn't match my surroundings. Panic started to creep in. I wasn't lost, I couldn't be. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of trees, it was something else. A low, guttural moan echoed through the woods, followed by the snap of a branch. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was tall to tall. My instinct was to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever was out there to reveal itself. The sound came again, closer this time. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent once more. I forced myself to move, slowly backing away from the direction of the sound. I had to get back to the main trail, back to the ranger station. But no matter which way I turned, the trees seemed to close in on me, blocking my way. As I stumbled through the fog, I saw something ahead, to glowing orbs floating in the distance. My heart leapt into my throat. They were eyes, reflecting in the beam of my flashlight. They were watching me. I pointed the light straight at them, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something large and gaunt, standing just beyond the fog. It looked human, but its limbs were elongated, and its skin was pale as moonlight. It didn't move, just stood there, staring. Without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. My legs burned as I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, moving faster than any human could. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an eternity, I burst into a clearing. My chest heaved, and my body ached, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw the faint glow of the ranger station's lights in the distance. I threw myself through the door and locked it behind me. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I returned to the area with another ranger. The fog had lifted, and the woods looked normal, peaceful even. But when we reached the clearing where I had first seen the creature, we found something strange. There, in the soft earth, were footprints, giant human-like prints, much larger than any person's. They led deep into the woods and disappeared into the darkness. We never spoke about it again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there had let me go. It had been watching, waiting, and it knew I would come back. I prided myself on being familiar with every inch of the woods. It was early October when I was assigned to a remote camping area, known for its beautiful fall foliage. The leaves were bursting with color, and the air was crisp. I looked forward to a quiet night under the stars. I set up my tent near the edge of a clearing, a safe distance from the campsite where a family had pitched their tent. They were friendly, two parents with two kids, eager to explore the woods. As night fell, the crackling fire provided a warm glow. I exchanged stories with them while they roasted marshmallows. When the kids were finally asleep, I said goodnight and retreated to my tent, hoping for a peaceful evening. The tranquility of the woods quickly turned unsettling. I heard strange noises drifting through the trees. A low rustling at first, then the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just the wind or perhaps a deer, but the air felt charged with tension. I peered out of my tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. A sudden snap of a branch jolted me upright. My heart raced. I was certain something was watching me. I crawled out of my tent, trying to quiet my breathing, listening intently. That's when I heard it. A faint whimpering, almost childlike, coming from the direction of the family's tent. I called out to them, but there was no response. The whimpering grew louder, echoing through the trees. Compelled by a mix of concern and fear, I cautiously approached their tent. It was unzipped slightly, and I pushed it open, ready to check on the family. The inside was empty, the sleeping bag still warm. Confused, I turned back toward my tent, but as I did, the whimpering stopped. Silence enveloped the woods, thick and suffocating. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. Suddenly, I heard a laugh, a high-pitched, gleeful sound that sent chills down my spine. It echoed through the trees, followed by more laughter. It was coming from the deeper woods. I knew the area well. There were no trails leading that way. Ignoring my better judgment, I followed the sound, pushing through the underbrush. With each step, the laughter turned to taunts, mocking me. "Come play with us," they seemed to say. I stumbled, catching my foot on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. As I got up, I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. My heart raced as I turned to face whatever was pursuing me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing there were two children, their clothes tattered and dirty, faces pale and expressionless. They stared at me with hollow eyes, not a hint of a smile. My breath caught in my throat. They didn't belong here. I felt a surge of panic, my instincts screaming at me to run. Just as I turned to flee, a figure darted past the trees, tall and dark, its form indistinguishable. I sprinted back toward the campsite, my heart pounding in my ears. Reaching my tent, I flung myself inside and zipped it up, my hands trembling. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup. There was no response. I could only hear my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Just when I thought I was safe, I heard the soft laughter again, right outside my tent. "Come play with us," the voice sang, sweet yet sinister. I held my breath, clutching my flashlight, every fiber of my being urging me to stay quiet. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of something scraping against the tent. I braced myself for the worst. Suddenly, the tent shook violently. I gasped, and the laughter returned, louder and more manic. "We're here," it echoed. I squeezed my eyes shut, counting the seconds until morning, praying for dawn to break. When the sun finally rose, the light spilled into my tent, illuminating the scene outside. I unzipped the entrance slowly, half expecting the dark figure or the children to be waiting. Instead, I found the campsite abandoned. The family's tent lay empty, but what caught my eye was the ground, marked with deep, claw-like scratches leading into the woods. As I stepped outside, I noticed something on the ground. A child's teddy bear lay there, its button eye missing. My heart sank. I turned to look back at the woods, now peaceful and serene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. I quickly packed my things, determined to report what I had encountered. As I made my way back to my truck, I glanced back one last time at the woods, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw the shadows of two children peering out from the trees, their laughter echoing in the wind. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the woods, but nothing could prepare me for that particular night in late October. The air was crisp, and the trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like skeletal sentinels against the moonlight. I had just finished a routine check of the campgrounds when I noticed a flickering light deep in the woods. It caught my eye because it was unusual. Most campers were already tucked away in their tents by this hour. Curiosity piqued. I grabbed my flashlight and set off toward the light. The crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as I walked deeper into the trees. With each step, a sense of unease crept in. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the trunks, illuminating the gnarled branches that twisted like skeletal fingers. As I got closer, I could see the light was coming from a clearing. It pulsed and flickered as if something was wrong with it. When I finally stepped into the clearing, my heart sank. In the center stood a small campfire, but there were no tents, no campers. Just the fire, sputtering in the chilly night air. I scanned the area, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. It was too quiet. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the fire crackling, and an overwhelming sense of dread enveloping me. Then I saw a figure darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. My breath hitched in my throat. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The figure moved too fast, too erratically to be human. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it vanished before I could catch a glimpse. Deciding to investigate further, I edged toward the fire. The flickering light illuminated something unusual at the edge of the flames, a backpack. I knelt down to inspect it, and as I reached for the zipper, I heard a low growl behind me. My heart raced as I whipped around, flashlight raised. The beam landed on the same figure from before, now standing just outside the light. It was tall, hunched, and covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed like embers, fixated on me. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming for me to run. The growl intensified, and in a panic, I bolted back toward the trail. I could hear it following me, its breath ragged and heavy as it closed the distance. I didn't look back, focusing only on the path ahead, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness. Just as I thought I might be free, I tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground. Pain shot through my knee as I scrambled to my feet. The creature was close now, its growl echoing in the stillness. I took off again, adrenaline surging through my veins, ignoring the throb in my leg. I could hear the rustling of leaves, branches snapping underfoot, but I didn't dare to look back. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the main path. The familiar surroundings were a brief comfort, but the creature was still behind me. I sprinted towards the ranger station, my breath coming in ragged gasps, praying I'd make it in time. As I reached the station, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, heart pounding. I grabbed the radio to call for help, but was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. I froze, my heart racing once more. The knocking came again, but this time it was gentle, almost pleading. I peered through the window. My eyes widened in disbelief. Standing at the door was a child, maybe 10 years old, wearing a tattered jacket. "Help me, please," she said, voice shaking. I quickly unlocked the door and let her in, confusion swirling in my mind. "Where are your parents?" I asked, glancing back toward the woods, half expecting the creature to appear. She pointed toward the forest. "They're lost." I heard something bad. I ran. Before I could respond, the radio crackled to life. "This is dispatch. We received a call about a missing child. Do you copy?" My stomach dropped. The child before me wasn't a lost camper. She was part of the missing family, and the creature wasn't after me. It was trying to protect her. I turned to look back outside, just as the growl echoed once more through the trees. I now understood what had happened. The woods were alive with a danger I could barely comprehend, and I had unwittingly walked into the middle of it. The child was safe for now, but the true terror of the forest was still lurking just outside. It was a crisp autumn evening when my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were a group of 4: Yana, Matt, Aaron, and me. The trees were ablaze with fall colors, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. We set up our camp near a small clearing, just off a winding path that we had traveled earlier that day. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. As the fire flickered, Yena suggested we go for a night hike. The idea sent a thrill through the group, fueled by both the adrenaline of our earlier laughter and the eerie beauty of the forest at night. We grabbed our flashlights and ventured down the dark trail, the shadows of the trees stretching ominously around us. The further we walked, the thicker the darkness became, and I could feel a strange tension in the air, like something was watching us. As we walked deeper into the woods, an unsettling noise broke the silence. It started as a faint rustling, but quickly escalated into a series of loud, clanking sounds. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The noise was accompanied by an odd flickering light that appeared in the distance. It danced like a candle, illuminating the nearby trees. "Do you see that?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. We all stopped, squinting into the darkness. The light grew closer, revealing a series of figures in white masks, each carrying a flickering lantern. They seemed to glide along the path, moving with a deliberate slowness that made my skin crawl. I could see chains wrapped around their bodies, clinking together as they moved. Panic surged through us. I instinctively grabbed Gina's arm, pulling her back into the shadows of the trees. We crouched behind a thick bush, our breaths coming in quick gasps. The figures drew closer, and as they passed by, I caught a glimpse of their empty, hollow eyes staring straight ahead. My heart thundered in my chest. a primal instinct telling me to run, but fear held us frozen in place. As they moved out of sight, the air felt heavy with dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were searching for something or someone. We sat in silence, barely daring to breathe, until the last of the figures disappeared into the darkness. After what felt like hours, we finally dared to emerge from our hiding place. Hearts pounding with terror, we decided it was best to return to our camp and pack up. But as we turned back, we were greeted by an even more horrifying sight. Our campsite was in disarray. Tents were ripped open, gear scattered across the ground, and the fire we had built was extinguished, save for a few dying embers. What happened? Aaron stammered, his face pale. But the worst part was what we found etched into the dirt where our fire had been. In crude letters, it read, "We know you're here." My stomach dropped, and I felt a surge of nausea. This wasn't just a prank, it was something far more sinister. Without waiting to grab our belongings, we sprinted back to the car, adrenaline driving us forward. I could hear the distant sounds of chains rattling again, echoing through the trees. Every second felt like an eternity as we stumbled toward our vehicle, fear urging us to move faster. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking as I finally managed to unlock the doors. We piled in, and I slammed the door shut, heart racing. Just as I turned the key in the ignition, a deafening bang echoed outside, as if something had slammed against the car. We screamed, instinctively ducking down as I gunned the engine and tore down the dirt path, leaving the horrors of the woods behind. As we drove further away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. To my horror, I saw the figures standing at the edge of the forest, their lanterns flickering in the darkness, watching us leave. We never spoke of that night again, but even now, I can still hear the distant clank of chains and feel the weight of those hollow eyes fixed upon me. What still haunts me, the realization that they were waiting, not just for us, but for someone else. Someone who had been there before us, and perhaps would be there again. The summer sun dipped low as we arrived at the campsite, a remote stretch of forest far from the buzz of civilization. I had always found solace in the woods, but something felt different this time. It was just me, Jenna, and Marcus' friends who were eager for a weekend of adventure, away from the constant hum of daily life. We set up our tents as the air cooled, and laughter filled the clearing as we roasted marshmallows by the fire. As darkness enveloped the forest, Jenna suggested we take a night hike. The idea sparked excitement, but I felt a twinge of hesitation. Still, the thrill of exploring the woods at night won out, and soon we were wandering deeper into the trees, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The forest was alive with sounds: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were boarded up. Intrigued, we approached cautiously. Marcus, ever the brave one, nudged the door, and to our surprise, it creaked open. A wave of unease washed over me, but my curiosity urged me forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jenna shone her flashlight around the room, illuminating faded photographs on the walls, images of families smiling, their eyes hauntingly empty. A sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, but I stayed, captivated by the strange energy that enveloped the cabin. We explored for a while, but as the shadows grew longer, we decided to head back to camp. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep in the woods. I froze, the sound crawling under my skin. It wasn't an animal, it was something else, something menacing. We hurried back to the campsite, the fire crackling warmly as we huddled close. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I exchanged glances with Jenna and Marcus, silently acknowledging the unease that hung in the air. As the night wore on, I found it harder to shake the feeling of dread. I suggested we play a game to distract ourselves. We ended up telling ghost stories, our voices hushed as the tales grew darker. At one point, Marcus shared a legend he'd heard about a creature that roamed these woods, a spirit that took the form of a lost traveler, luring people into the forest never to return. Just as he finished, a loud crash echoed from the woods. My heart raced as we all jumped, flashlights flickering nervously in the direction of the sound. We strained to see, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged, illuminated briefly by our lights. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, wearing tattered clothes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with an unsettling intensity. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Help me, they're coming for me." We were frozen, the air thick with tension. I looked at Jenna and Marcus, both pale and wide-eyed. The man took a step closer, and in that moment, something shifted in the shadows behind him. More figures appeared, all with the same hollow eyes and tattered clothes. They emerged like wraiths from the darkness, their bodies flickering in and out of the light. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, we scrambled for the safety of the trees. Hearts pounding in our chests, we ducked behind a large oak, breathless and terrified, as the figures advanced, their murmurs echoing through the night. I could feel the weight of their gaze, chilling and predatory. Then, just as we thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a voice whispering my name from the depths of the woods. It sounded just like Jenna. My stomach dropped. The growls returned, closer now, mingling with the whispers. Realizing we were being lured into the forest, I grabbed Jenna's arm and pulled her back. "We have to go," I shouted. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our escape, not stopping until we burst into the clearing where our campfire flickered in the darkness. We made it back to the tents, shaking and terrified, convinced we'd escaped whatever haunted those woods. As dawn broke, we packed our belongings in silence, the shadows of the night still looming large in our minds. Just before we left, I glanced back at the cabin. Its presence felt like a dark secret. There was a flash of movement in one of the windows, a face peering out, grinning wide. I blinked, and it was gone. We jumped into the car and drove away, vowing never to return, but the memories of that night would haunt us forever. Little did we know, we weren't the first to escape those woods, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. The sun was setting when we arrived at the camping site, a secluded spot deep in the woods. My friends and I were excited to escape the bustle of our daily lives. We set up our tents, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal while the forest slowly transformed into a dark, mysterious landscape. We shared stories around the flickering flames, laughing and feeling the bond of friendship strengthen with every passing hour. As night fell, the sounds of the forest grew louder. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the trees. Yena, always the adventurous one, suggested we explore the nearby trails. She claimed they were old ruins just a short walk away, remnants of an old homestead swallowed by nature. The idea excited us, so we grabbed our flashlights and set off into the darkness. The woods were thick, and the beam of our flashlights seemed to barely penetrate the shadows. We joked and laughed, but an unsettling feeling crept in as we ventured deeper. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes made us pause. Yena teased us, saying we were just scared of the dark, but I could feel something was off. After about half an hour of walking, we came upon a clearing. In the center stood the remains of a dilapidated cabin. Its walls were rotting, and the windows were broken, like empty eyes staring into the night. The air grew still, and an uneasy tension settled over us. We exchanged glances, each of us silently questioning whether this was a good idea. Then, just as I was about to suggest we head back, we heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was distant, but unmistakable. Panic washed over us. Yena, always bold, insisted we investigate. The others hesitated, but eventually, curiosity got the better of us, and we followed her deeper into the trees. As we moved cautiously, the growling grew louder, mixed with the sound of something heavy dragging along the forest floor. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Suddenly, we spotted a flicker of light in the distance, moving erratically. It wasn't a flashlight, it was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods. We crouched behind a cluster of bushes, hearts pounding in our chests. From our hidden spot, we watched in horror as a figure emerged. It was a tall man, but he was dressed in tattered clothing, chains rattling around his ankles as he walked. His face was obscured by a grotesque mask made from twisted branches and leaves, and in his hand, he held a lantern that flickered ominously. As he passed, we held our breath, hoping he wouldn't notice us. But the man stopped abruptly, turning his head slightly as if sensing our presence. My stomach dropped, Yena gasped, and I shot her a warning look. We couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The figure slowly raised his lantern, illuminating the area around him. It cast eerie shadows across the trees. My pulse raced as I thought we were about to be discovered. But instead, he turned and continued deeper into the woods, dragging something heavy behind him. I could barely breathe. Fear had paralyzed me. After a few agonizing moments, we decided we had to get out of there. We retraced our steps, moving quietly through the underbrush, desperate to return to the safety of our camp. The night felt suffocating, and every rustle of leaves sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. When we finally reached our campsite, it felt like we'd emerged from a nightmare, but the relief was short-lived. Our camp was in chaos. Tents were slashed, our gear scattered, and the fire was extinguished. A message was carved into the ground, eerily illuminated by the moonlight. "You shouldn't have come here." My heart raced as I scanned the area. In the distance, I saw a flicker of lantern light again, this time closer. The realization hit me like ice water. The man was coming for us. We grabbed what we could and fled to our car, breathless with fear and disbelief. As we sped away, the adrenaline began to fade, and we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We drove for hours, not speaking, just processing the night's events. When we finally returned home, we promised never to return to those woods. But every Halloween, as the days grow shorter and the nights darker, I remember that night. Sometimes I hear faint chains clanking in my mind, and I can't help but wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into his domain. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy. Frozen in place, I watched as they danced around the fire. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing, no tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves, eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed. As a park ranger, I had seen my share of odd things in the deep woods, but nothing prepared me for the night of the storm. It was late October, and the trees had shed most of their leaves, leaving the forest eerily bare. The air felt thick with anticipation as I patrolled the campground, the wind rustling the branches overhead like whispers of a forgotten language. I had just finished my usual rounds when the first raindrops began to fall. I headed back to my truck, ready to ride out the storm. That's when I received the radio call. A family had set up camp in a remote area, and they reported strange noises coming from the woods. Their kids were terrified, and the father asked for someone to check it out. I hesitated. I knew that area was notoriously isolated. Still, I felt a duty to help. With the rain now pouring, I drove as far as I could on the muddy trail, parking a good half-mile from their campsite. The light from my flashlight flickered in the dark, illuminated only by the occasional crack of lightning. I felt an unsettling chill as I walked toward their tent, the wet ground squelching beneath my boots. The sound of rain drowned out the forest sounds, creating an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. Upon reaching the campsite, I called out to them. No answer. I peered into the tent, half expecting to see the family huddled inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags were neatly arranged, their backpacks untouched. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I stepped back, scanning the area, when I heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the nearby thicket. Adrenaline surged through me, but I couldn't abandon my duty. I called out again, asking if anyone was there. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Just as I turned to leave, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. A figure, tall and slender, stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't look human. The figure stepped closer, and my heart raced as I tried to make out its features. It was all wrong to tall, limbs elongated, and its skin glistened like wet bark. I stumbled back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but I knew I couldn't leave without confirming the family's safety. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders, and shone my flashlight in its direction. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing not one figure, but several shadows shifting just beyond the trees, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. I felt a rush of panic as I realized they were closing in on me, the growling growing louder. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, a chilling mix of anger and desperation. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the wet ground, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I darted through the trees, branches whipping against my face. I could hear them behind me, their movements swift and unnatural, and I pushed myself to go faster, fueled by sheer terror. As I burst back onto the main trail, the growling ceased. I stopped, panting heavily, glancing back into the woods. The darkness loomed silent, as if nothing had ever been there. I fumbled for my radio, my hands shaking. Just as I was about to call for help, I caught sight of a flicker of movement in the trees. It was then that I saw them. The family I had come to find was standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring at me with wide eyes. They were unharmed, but their faces were pale, their expressions frozen in fear. I rushed over, relief flooding my chest. I asked what had happened. The father shook his head, his voice trembling. They had been hearing strange noises all night, but when they stepped out of the tent to investigate, they saw something in the shadows watching them. They didn't know what it was, but it terrified them into staying inside. As we gathered around my truck, the father suddenly pointed behind me. I turned slowly, dread washing over me. Just beyond the trees stood the figure again, but this time it was smiling, a twisted grin splitting its face. My heart dropped as the realization hit me. It had been playing with us, waiting for the right moment to strike. In that instant, the lights on my truck flickered, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck. The family clutched each other, and I could feel my body tense as the air grew thick with malice. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. We had survived for now, but the woods were still alive with something sinister, and we were far from safe. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights patrolling the deep woods. The stars overhead shine brightly, casting an ethereal glow on the forest floor, but there are times when that beauty feels sinister. One October night, my shift began like any other, but it quickly turned into a nightmare. I was out on the usual trail, checking campsites and making sure everything was in order. The air was crisp, and the wind whispered through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I had just finished my rounds when I got a call on the radio from a couple camping a few miles deeper in the woods. They reported strange noises outside their tent, things that sounded like whispers and shuffling feet. I told them I would head over immediately, assuring them it was probably just the wind. As I hiked through the dense underbrush, unease settled in my stomach. The noises they described didn't sit well with me. I picked up my pace, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing the gnarled roots and thick brush. The deeper I went, the darker it became. My flashlight flickered intermittently, and I mentally cursed the batteries. Finally, I reached the couple's campsite. Their tent was pitched, but eerily quiet. I called out to them, but there was no response. I approached the tent and carefully unzipped it. Peering inside, it was empty. Sleeping bags were still rolled up, their belongings neatly stowed, but they were nowhere to be found. My heart raced. I stepped back, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of struggle or distress. That's when I heard it, a low growl, reverberating through the trees. I felt it in my bones, a primal sound that struck fear into my heart. I quickly turned, shining my flashlight in every direction. The forest was still, but I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor creeping in. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement behind a nearby tree. I shined my flashlight toward it. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. It looked like a man, but was unnaturally thin, almost emaciated. His skin glimmered in the flashlight's beam, pale and sickly. He held a hand up as if trying to shield himself from the light. But what struck me were his eyes. They were wide and wild, filled with an unsettling mix of fear and hunger. I stumbled back, my breath quickening as I fought the urge to scream. The man stepped forward, and I could see he was not quite right. His movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the growl still echoing behind me. I darted through the trees, branches scratching at my arms and face. I didn't stop to look back, driven by instinct. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every shadow morphing into something sinister. I finally reached the main path and sprinted toward my truck, fumbling with my keys as I desperately tried to get the engine to start. Just as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, illuminated by my headlights. But as I drove away, my pulse racing, I realized I hadn't seen him alone. I had glimpsed the couple huddled behind him, their eyes wide with terror, as if they were under some kind of spell. I returned to the ranger station and reported everything. We launched a search team back into the woods, but when we arrived, there was no sign of the couple. The area was as quiet as it had been when I first found the tent. The park was deemed safe, but I knew what I had seen. The ranger community brushed it off as a story, a figment of my imagination after being out in the woods too long. Years later, I still hear whispers when the wind howls through the trees. I've moved on, taking a different job away from the woods, but something lingers in my mind. I wonder if the couple ever made it out. Or perhaps they are still there, trapped in that darkness, forever watching the woods for the next park ranger who dares to venture too close. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the chaos of our lives and reconnect with nature. My friends and I set out to a remote spot deep in the woods, eager to bask in the tranquility of the great outdoors. After setting up our tents and gathering firewood, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. As darkness enveloped us, we huddled around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The warmth of the fire felt comforting against the chill that settled in. As the evening progressed, Yana, always the adventurous one, suggested a night hike. She teased that it would be scary, and her excitement was contagious. The others hesitated, but eventually, we all agreed. Fueled by the thrill of the unknown, with flashlights in hand, we ventured deeper into the woods. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of distant owls, but it also felt eerily quiet, as if nature was holding its breath. We laughed and joked, but an undercurrent of unease settled among us as the darkness thickened. Suddenly, a chilling sound pierced the night. It was a faint clanking, like chains dragging along the forest floor. My heart raced as the noise grew louder, echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, the laughter dying on our lips. Then we saw tiny pinpricks of light glowing in the distance, slowly moving toward us. Panic surged through me. We ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes, barely daring to breathe. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as we strained to see what was approaching. The lights drew closer, illuminating the figures moving in the darkness. They were shrouded in white, their faces obscured by masks that gleamed in the dim light. Each figure held a lantern, their bodies wrapped in chains that rattled with every step. The group moved in unison, their steps deliberate, almost as if they were searching for something or someone. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I glanced at my friends, their faces pale with fear. We stayed hidden, our hearts pounding in our chests, as the figures passed just feet from our hiding spot. The clanking of chains mixed with the soft whispering of their voices, unintelligible but laced with a sense of urgency. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of our presence, that they were hunting for us. After what felt like an eternity, the figures moved on, disappearing into the darkness. We waited in silence, our minds racing with questions. Who were they? What did they want? As dawn approached, we finally emerged from our hiding place. Shaking with fear and disbelief, we made our way back to camp, still in shock from what we had witnessed. As the sun rose, illuminating our campsite, we felt a wave of relief wash over us. But that relief quickly turned to dread as we approached the fire pit. Our gear was scattered, the tents torn, and the fire, which we had put out before our hike, was blazing brightly. In the dirt beside the fire, words were scrawled hastily. You shouldn't have come. Panic surged through us again as we realized someone had been here. Someone had vandalized our camp while we were gone. I turned to my friends, their faces pale, and we all felt the same unspoken thought. We needed to get out of there. We quickly packed up what we could salvage, our hearts racing as we kept glancing over our shoulders, half expecting those masked figures to emerge from the trees. As we stumbled back to our car, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When we finally drove away, the forest faded into the background, but the sense of dread lingered. I thought about how quickly our adventure had turned into a nightmare. It wasn't until we were miles down the road that I dared to glance at the rearview mirror. I froze. Standing in the road, illuminated by the morning light, was a figure in white, the same mask gleaming in the sun, a lantern swinging at their side. I gasped, and my friends turned to look, but by the time we turned around, the road was empty. We never spoke of that night again, but every year, when fall approached, I felt that familiar chill creep back in, reminding me that the woods were not as empty as they seemed, and that some secrets are best left undiscovered. It was supposed to be a typical weekend getaway, just a small group of us venturing into the woods for a peaceful hike. We were far from the usual trails, deep into an area that was barely touched by anyone, with dense trees and the kind of silence that felt unnatural. We set up camp near an old, forgotten trail, with nothing but a few old maps to guide us. The sun dipped low as we built our fire, its flickering light casting long shadows across the clearing. We didn't know it then, but that night would change everything. By the time we finished dinner, the sky was completely dark. The fire crackled, and we sat around it, sharing stories, laughing, and enjoying the isolation. As the night wore on, the woods seemed to grow quieter, heavier. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, had stopped. All that remained was the sound of our voices, which now seemed to loud against the oppressive silence. At one point, I stepped away from the fire to relieve myself. The forest was so dark that even with the flashlight, the trees seemed to swallow the light whole. As I made my way through the brush, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a sense of being watched, but I told myself it was just the isolation. When I finished and turned back toward the camp, I heard a noise. It was a soft scraping, like something dragging along the ground. My heart skipped. I shone my light around, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I quickly made my way back to the fire. When I returned, everyone was still talking, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. The laughter had stopped, and everyone seemed to be glancing nervously toward the woods. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the dark messing with our minds. But then we heard it, a rustling, deeper in the woods than any animal could have made. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer, this was something far heavier, something that wasn't moving in the usual way. My stomach tightened as we all turned toward the sound, eyes wide. Probably just a bear, one of my friends said, but his voice was shaky. We waited, frozen, nothing. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The air felt colder suddenly, and my breath fogged in front of me. The noise stopped, and everything went dead quiet again. Then came the voice. It wasn't a growl or a screech, but a soft, guttural whisper. It came from somewhere behind me, low enough to be barely audible. Leave. My blood ran cold. The others hadn't heard it. They were still looking at the trees, trying to figure out what had made the noise. I felt a cold hand wrap around my spine. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and turned to shine it in the direction of the voice, and I saw it, a figure, barely discernible in the shadows. It was tall and unnaturally still. My heart pounded in my chest as I froze, unable to move. I could see nothing but the silhouette, but the feeling it gave off was suffocating. It was staring right at me, its face hidden in the dark. I didn't know what to do. The others were still oblivious, talking amongst themselves, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, watching. I backed up slowly, moving toward the fire. It wasn't until I had nearly reached the circle of light that it disappeared, slipping back into the woods like smoke. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been very wrong. The rest of the night was a blur. We sat around the fire in silence, no one daring to speak about what had happened. I didn't want to mention what I saw, afraid I'd sound crazy. But the unease lingered, and as the fire burned low, we decided to go to sleep. Though no one slept well, the next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave. As we broke down camp, one of my friends stumbled upon something strange, a large, twisted piece of bark. It was fresh, not from the forest around us. But what made it worse was the carving. It was the same symbol we'd seen the night before. A figure, tall, watching. We left immediately after that. No one spoke of it again. But, as we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing by the edge of the woods, barely visible in the trees, was the figure, watching. We all saw it this time. And that was when I realized it wasn't something that had been in the woods at all. It had followed us back. I've never been one to believe in things that go bump in the night. Ghost stories, strange noises, and eerie happenings. They've always been things I laughed off, shrugged at, or chalked up to the wind or some animal rustling around in the trees. That changed the weekend, my friends, and I decided to camp in a secluded area deep in the woods. It was early autumn, the air crisp with that first bite of cold. We picked the spot because it was far from the usual trails, tucked between two ridges where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely made it to the forest floor. Perfect for a weekend away, or so we thought. The first night was peaceful enough. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and spent hours talking and laughing. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air as the evening shadows grew longer. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more remote it felt, and though we joked about how alone we were, there was an odd feeling of unease that hung in the air. We brushed it off, of course, the typical chatter of, "It's just the woods, and nothing's out here." But as we lay in our tents that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt too deliberate, too close. I tried to ignore it, but my heart raced with each strange noise. I must have dozed off eventually, though I kept waking in the dark, listening, waiting for the next sound. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if the others were awake, but I could hear a faint rustling in their tents, as if they'd heard it too. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing for what felt like minutes at a time. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, but before I could move, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Get out here." It was faint, but clear. A low, gravelly voice that sounded almost like it was coming from under the ground. I gripped the flashlight harder, my pulse pounding in my ears. We had come far into the woods, far enough that no one should be out there. At this hour. Not near us. I waited for a response from my friends, but the camp was unnervingly quiet. The footsteps resumed, but now they sounded closer, much too close. I felt my skin crawl as they circled the tent again, stopping directly at the entrance. I couldn't stay there any longer. I unzipped the flap of the tent, and for a split second, I saw something, a dark shape, hunched low, standing in the distance just beyond the circle of firelight. It was tall, but unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch out from its body in odd angles. I froze, barely daring to breathe, watching the shape shift slightly as though it were moving in the shadows. I jumped to my feet and yanked my friends out of their tents, whispering urgently, "We need to go, now." They were disoriented, but we gathered what little we could and bolted toward the trail. The forest felt alive with sounds now. The wind seemed to howl, and branches cracked underfoot like they were being crushed. Every step we took felt like something was just behind us, getting closer. But when we dared look back, we saw nothing. The shape I had seen was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where the trees finally started to thin. We made it to the clearing, gasping for air, hearts racing in the moonlight. But, as we caught our breath and tried to calm down, we noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones leading toward our campsite from the very spot where the strange footsteps had been earlier. They weren't animal tracks, but human, barefoot, and they were deep, like someone had been standing there for hours. But here's the thing that made my stomach drop. When we checked our tents, everything was exactly as we had left it. Nothing was disturbed. Our gear, our bags, even the food we had left out was untouched. It was as if whoever or whatever had followed us hadn't been there at all. We packed up in silence, all of us eager to get as far from that spot as possible. No one spoke a word about the strange footprints until much later. We never went back to that area, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't laugh off the idea that something was out there, something waiting. Years later, I came across an old map of the area. It was an archive map that marked the trail we had used, but what made my skin crawl was the label on the spot we had camped. It wasn't marked as a campsite or a trailhead. Instead, it was simply labeled, "Do not enter." It was as though someone knew. It was a group of us, 5 friends from college, seeking a weekend of escape in the remote wilderness. None of us had ever camped in a place like this, far off the usual trails. Our phones had no signal, which only added to the appeal. The kind of place where you could unplug and truly be free. We had chosen a clearing by a small creek, surrounded by towering pines. The fire pit was already there, an old circle of stones, blackened by years of use. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was profound, like the world had forgotten us. As night fell, we settled around the campfire, cracking jokes and drinking beers. The flames danced and cracked, casting long, flickering shadows. I noticed it was unusually quiet, Even for the woods, no owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the brush. Just the fire and the sound of the creek. It didn't seem right, but I shrugged it off. By around midnight, we were all in our tents. I was sharing with 2 others, and the others were spread out nearby. It wasn't cold yet, but the dampness in the air seeped in, making the inside of the tent feel heavier than it should. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like something lightly tapping against the canvas of our tent. I held my breath, trying to place it. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel, but the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. I turned to my friends, but neither of them seemed to hear it. I glanced out the tiny window flap, but there was nothing. Just blackness. I convinced myself it was just the wind. We were deep in the woods, after all, but then it came again, louder this time. A tap, 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 right near my ear. My heart thudded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight, shining it at the spot where the sound was coming from. Nothing. I wanted to call out to the others, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I tried to lie still, hoping it would stop. But instead, the sound grew in intensity, as if whatever it was moving around the tent, circling it, tapping at every corner. My friends still didn't stir, and I wasn't sure if I should wake them up. I grabbed my pocket knife, feeling ridiculous, but protective, and I decided to step out and check the perimeter. The moment my foot touched the cold ground outside, the scratching stopped. A sudden, unnatural silence settled in. I scanned the trees. There was nothing, just the faint outline of the forest beyond the fire's glow. No eyes, no movement. I walked a few paces away from the tent, my flashlight casting long shadows. The silence was unbearable now. Every crackling branch, every gust of wind, made me jump. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe an animal had gotten too curious, but as I turned to head back, something caught my eye in the distance. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, was a figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but it stood still, staring in our direction. I froze. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't wait. I rushed back to the tent, my heart racing. I woke my friends, and they looked at me with confusion, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but they dismissed it, laughing it off as an overactive imagination. Maybe it was just another camper passing through, but I knew what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there. We sat around the fire for a while, talking about the strange feeling in the air, but eventually, we settled back into the tents. The sound of the creek, the rustling of leaves, everything felt wrong now. I didn't sleep much, half expecting that scratching to return, half hoping it wouldn't. Then, at 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something far worse than scratching. It was a voice, whispering my name. I jerked upright, heart pounding. The voice was soft but clear, coming from the far side of the camp. I looked at my friends, but they were still asleep, breathing steadily. The beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the firelight, dressed in rags, with eyes wide open and unblinking, staring straight at me. But the most chilling part was that the figure was holding a flashlight. My flashlight. I turned back to the camp. My friends were still asleep. I don't know how I got back to the tent, but somehow, I managed to crawl in and zip it shut. My hand shook as I held the flashlight, my mind racing. That thing, whoever it was, had been watching us, mimicking me. We packed up and left at first light. As we drove away, I glanced back at the clearing, now bathed in the early morning light. I didn't see anyone, but I'll never forget the sound of my voice, whispering from the woods. My friends and I chose a secluded spot deep in the forest, miles away from any trails or campsites. The idea was to get lost in nature and enjoy the quiet. We had no idea how quickly the peace would unravel. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sky painted with shades of orange and pink as we unloaded our gear. The trees here were dense, their trunks thick and dark. The sun barely filtered through the leaves. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and built a fire at the center of our camp. As the evening deepened, the air grew colder, and the fire's crackling was the only sound that broke the silence. At first, the forest seemed comforting, isolated, untouched. But as night fell, a strange unease began to settle over me. It wasn't anything specific, just an overwhelming feeling that something was off. I kept pushing it down, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. We sat around the fire, telling stories and laughing. Then, just as I was about to take a sip of water, I heard something. A soft rustle in the bushes, too deliberate to be an animal. Everyone else was distracted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling persisted. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. A sudden movement in the tree line caught my eye, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. My heart started to race. I forced myself to smile and join the conversation, but I couldn't ignore the growing discomfort gnawing at me. Around midnight, we decided to head to bed. The forest was pitch black now, the fire a dying glow in the distance. I crawled into my tent, trying to ignore the eerie silence of the night. I zipped it up, rolled into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. There was something out there. I could feel it. Every rustle of the wind in the trees, every crack of a twig seemed too loud, too close. I tried to convince myself it was just my nerves. But the longer I lay there, the more restless I became. Then, a sound pierced the night, a soft whisper, just outside my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind, not the trees. It was a voice, faint but distinct. Help ... I couldn't breathe. My mind raced. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. The voice came again, clearer this time. Help me. I reached for the zipper of my tent, my fingers trembling. I had to know who or what was out there. I slowly unzipped the flap and poked my head out, scanning the darkness. The forest was still. No movement, no sounds, just the rustling of leaves. Then, I heard it again, right behind me. Help me. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was nothing, just the empty space inside my tent, the dark forest outside. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to zip the tent back up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I lay still, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, this time louder. Help me, please. This time, it didn't sound like a person. It sounded like a plea, like something trapped. My skin prickled with fear, and I fought the urge to scream. What was happening? Who was calling out for help? I could feel the tension in the air, the way the world seemed to hold its breath. I listened carefully, my pulse hammering in my ears. And that's when I heard something that froze my blood. A voice, deep and rasping, came from just outside my tent. I'm behind you. I didn't move. I couldn't. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear its soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around my tent. The world felt suffocating. Suddenly, a sharp knock on the side of my tent sent me flying out of my sleeping bag, heart racing. I scrambled to turn on my flashlight, but the beam shook so violently I could barely focus it. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice familiar, but wrong. You're not alone. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The forest was still, too still. I turned it off and on again, the beam cutting through the night. That's when I saw it, a figure, a face, pale and distorted, staring at me through the fabric of the tent. I gasped, heart in my throat. It vanished instantly, as if it had never been there at all. I threw the tent open and bolted outside, my friends standing around the fire. I could hardly speak, but when I managed to, all I could say was that we needed to leave. Now, we packed up in a hurry, our hearts pounding in our chests, and we didn't stop until we were miles away. The most terrifying part, when we looked at the photos we had taken earlier in the day. One image stood out. A shot of the trees with the camp in the background. In the upper corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure tall and thin, with hollow, staring eyes. It was the face I had seen in the tent. I've seen a lot of strange things, animals behaving oddly, signs of storms that seemed to form out of nowhere, but nothing could prepare me for the night I had last spring. That night, I realized how much the forest hides from us. It all started as a routine patrol. The weather was turning cold, and I was assigned to a more isolated part of the park, an area where few people ventured. There was a small cabin near the trailhead, and my job was to check that everything was secure, ensuring no one had been up to mischief. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. As I made my way down the winding path, the trees were dense, blocking most of the fading daylight. The usual noises of the forest had quieted, which struck me as odd. It wasn't completely silent, but it felt like the woods were holding their breath. The birds, the wind, even the rustling of leaves had all faded. I reached the cabin just as night was beginning to fall. The air had turned chilly, and a dense fog began rolling in. I walked around the perimeter, checked the windows, and made sure the door was locked. The place felt abandoned, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to the front of the cabin, ready to head back when I heard a noise behind me, something subtle, but distinct. A faint scraping sound, as if something was dragging across the wooden floor inside the cabin. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My flashlight flickered as I tried to peer through the fog in the cabin's windows. There was no movement, but that sound continued, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I took a few cautious steps back toward the cabin door, considering my options. The scraping sound continued, now joined by a soft thumping. It was almost rhythmic, like footsteps. I had to check. I pulled out my keys and hesitated for just a second before unlocking the door. I swung it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. The inside of the cabin was empty. No animals, no intruders, just dust and old furniture. But the scraping sound. It stopped the moment I stepped inside. I shined my flashlight across the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but then I noticed something strange. The floorboards, they were new to new. I'd been in this cabin many times before, and the floor had always been worn, creaking underfoot. But now, the boards looked fresh, freshly laid, and unnaturally smooth. My heart started racing. I knelt down to examine the floor more closely, and that's when I saw a small, jagged crack at the edge of one of the boards. Something was behind it. I used my flashlight to peer into the crack and saw a flash of white. I leaned in closer, instinctively reaching out to touch the crack. That's when the scraping sound returned. It was louder this time, right behind me, coming from just inside the walls. I jerked around, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to think, but every instinct screamed at me to run. The scraping didn't stop, and now there was a low, guttural breathing sound coming from within the walls of the cabin. One had to get out of there. I backed toward the door, fumbling for my keys, but before I could turn the handle, the breathing stopped. And then, something much worse happened. The floorboards beneath me creaked, but not in the usual way. It was as if something heavy was moving below the ground, crawling beneath the floor. I stepped back, my flashlight casting a trembling beam across the cabin. Then, with a sickening crack, the floorboard where I had been kneeling snapped upward. I jumped back, terrified, but nothing emerged from the hole. The scraping had stopped, and all I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I didn't wait another second. I rushed out of the cabin, slammed the door shut, and sprinted back down the trail, not stopping until I reached the ranger station. It wasn't until the next morning that I returned with a colleague to investigate the cabin. We pried up the floorboards, expecting to find the usual critters or perhaps an old forgotten stash of supplies. Instead, we found a hole beneath the floor, but no signs of any animals. What we did find were several old, decayed personal items, clothes, shoes, and a faded journal. It looked like someone had lived there once, but there was no record of any other park rangers ever having occupied the cabin. As I flipped through the journal, the last entry sent a cold chill through me. It's not just the trees that watch. Something else is out there, waiting for us to leave. We never spoke about that night again. It started as a normal evening. I was visiting an old friend who had recently moved into a big, creaky house on the edge of a dense forest. The place had a charm to it, but it also felt far too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. My friend had invited a few of us over to help unpack, and by the time the sun sank, we were gathered in the living room surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, laughing and joking over pizza and drinks. The house had its quirks. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the plumbing let out strange, hollow knocks. We brushed it off at first. It was an old house after all, and old houses have personality. That's what my friend kept saying. As the night went on, we decided to explore the house more thoroughly. None of us had seen the attic yet, And in a house this old, the attic felt like a guaranteed treasure trove of weird history. The door to the attic was in the upstairs hallway, hidden behind an old pull-down ladder. The ladder creaked under our weight as we climbed up one by one. The air changed as soon as we stepped into the attic. It was colder, and the smell was heavier, like old wood and mildew. The attic was full of dusty boxes, cobweb-covered furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. It looked like no one had touched the place in decades. We were rummaging through the boxes when we found something odd. It was an old photo album, but the photos inside weren't ordinary. They were black and white and showed a family, but their faces were strangely blurred. It wasn't from age or damage. It looked deliberate, as though someone had smeared their faces out before the pictures were taken. There were captions written in neat handwriting beneath each photo, but the ink had bled and run, making the words unreadable. That was when we heard it. A low, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere beneath us. At first, we thought it might be pipes again, but the sound was too deliberate. It was slow, steady, like someone knocking lightly on a wooden door. We stopped and stared at each other, unsure of what to do. My friend shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house settling, but the rest of us weren't convinced. The tapping stopped, but something else caught my attention. In the far corner of the attic, there was a mirror leaning against the wall, its surface grimy and cracked. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but I stepped closer. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The reflection didn't match what I was seeing. Behind me, I could see my friends standing in the attic, but in the mirror, they weren't moving. They stood frozen, their faces blank and staring directly at me. My stomach dropped, I turned around, and my friends were exactly as they should have been, laughing nervously and trying to decide whether to leave. I looked back at the mirror, and now the reflection was normal. I told myself my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to head back downstairs. As we climbed down the ladder, I was the last one to leave the attic. Just as I reached the bottom, I felt a cold hand brush against my ankle. I jumped, nearly falling, and turned to look. There was nothing there. My friends laughed nervously at my reaction, but I could see in their eyes that they were spooked. Back in the living room, we tried to distract ourselves with more jokes and stories, but the unease lingered. That's when the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as we fumbled for our phones and flashlights. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the staircase. The beam of my flashlight caught the stairs, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There was a figure standing halfway down, its face pale and featureless, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, watching us, or at least I think it was watching. We froze, not daring to breathe. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked back up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't stay to investigate. We grabbed our things and bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were outside in the safety of the night air. My friend moved out a week later after finding scratches on the attic walls and hearing whispers at night. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I don't want to. All I know is that when I look in mirrors now, I can't help but wonder if the reflection I'm seeing is really mine. I've never told anyone about this. It happened on a trip to a remote cabin in the woods. A group of us wanted to disconnect from the world for a weekend. The cabin was old and tucked deep in the forest, far enough away that cell phones were useless. It seemed perfect, quiet, peaceful, and isolated. We arrived late afternoon. The air was cool, the forest dense and shadowed. The cabin felt like it had been forgotten by time, but we brushed off the unease. It was just the kind of atmosphere we were looking for. By the time night fell, we had a fire going and were sharing drinks and stories, laughing at everything and nothing. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. Around midnight, we decided to stretch our legs. Flashlights in hand, we wandered into the woods. The trees loomed tall, their branches reaching overhead to block out most of the moonlight. The forest felt alive, and not in a comforting way. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every step we took made me feel like something was following us, just out of sight. The leader of the group stopped suddenly. His flashlight beam froze on a tree. I moved closer to see what he was looking at. There, scratched into the bark, was a message. Don't trust the light. The words sent a shiver through me. They looked old but fresh at the same time, as if someone had just written them, but the bark had already healed over. It made no sense. One of us joked that it was just an old camper trying to scare people. None of us laughed. We turned back toward the cabin, but the woods seemed different. The path felt narrower. The trees were closer together, their branches twisting unnaturally. The air grew colder, and our flashlights started flickering. The wind stopped. The forest went silent, no leaves rustling, no distant animals, just an oppressive, unnatural quiet. Then, ahead of us, a bright light appeared. It wasn't from a flashlight or a lantern. It was pure white and glowing, floating in midair. It started moving toward us. We froze, unsure of what we were seeing. The light wasn't steady. It pulsed, almost like it was breathing. Someone whispered that we should go back, but before we could move, the light surged forward. We ran. The light chased us through the forest, darting between the trees faster than we could move. No matter how hard we ran, it stayed close, weaving through the dark like it was alive. My legs burned, my heart pounded, and all I could think about was getting away from it. We broke through the tree line and into the clearing around the cabin. The light stopped, hovering at the edge of the forest as if there was an invisible barrier we couldn't cross. We stumbled inside, slamming the door and locking it. No one spoke. We sat there, listening to the silence, too afraid to look out the window. When morning came, we cautiously stepped outside. The forest looked normal again. The path was clear, the trees ordinary. But when we checked the spot where we'd seen the message on the tree, it was gone. No scratches, no marks, as if it had never been there. We packed up and left. None of us spoke about what happened, but every now and then, I think about the light. I still don't understand what it was or why it stopped at the edge of the clearing. But sometimes, late at night, I see flashes of white out of the corner of my eye, and I hear the faintest whisper, as if it's still calling to me. Don't trust the light. I didn't believe in ghosts. I never had. That was, until the night I spent in the old farmhouse. It started as a dare, a stupid bet among friends. Spend one night in the place everyone whispered about, but no one dared to enter. They said the last family to live there had vanished. No one knew why or how. The house had sat empty for years, with broken windows staring out like blind eyes. I arrived just before sunset, armed with a flashlight, a fully charged phone, and a backpack stuffed with snacks and a blanket. The place looked worse up close, with ivy choking the sides and rot eating at the doorframe. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic tang. Every creak of the floor under my boots echoed like gunfire in the silence. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I stayed in the living room, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. The furniture was old and mismatched, covered in a thick layer of dust. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its face cracked, hands frozen at 3 minutes past midnight. That should have unsettled me more than it did. At around 10 p.m., the noises began. It started subtly, a faint tapping, like fingers on glass, coming from the upstairs windows. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, though the trees outside were completely still. The tapping grew louder, then stopped. Just when I thought it was over, I heard something new. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy steps creaking across the wooden floor above me. My breath caught in my throat, and my flashlight trembled as I pointed it at the ceiling. The footsteps moved toward the staircase. I braced myself, expecting to see something horrifying emerge, but nothing appeared. The steps stopped abruptly, halfway down the stairs. I shone my light up the staircase, illuminating empty space. I told myself it was the house settling, that old wood creak like that, but deep down, I knew better. Just after midnight, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. The air grew icy cold, and my breath puffed out in white clouds. I heard whispers, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. They came from the corners of the room, from the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My heart pounded as I spun in circles, trying to find the source, but the whispers moved, always staying just out of reach. That's when I saw the painting. I hadn't noticed it earlier. but it hung above the fireplace, depicting a man, woman, and 2 children. The family stared out with unerringly blank expressions. I swore their eyes followed me as I moved. Then, the woman's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table, and my flashlight beam flickered. When the light steadied, the painting was just as it had been, the faces frozen in their original stoic expressions. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, but the door wouldn't open. The knob turned, but it was like something was holding it shut. I heard laughter then, soft at first, then louder, echoing around me. It sounded like children, their giggles high-pitched and wrong, as though they came from tiny throats filled with static. The laughter stopped abruptly. I turned to find myself face to face with a woman from the painting. Her eyes were empty sockets, her smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing too many teeth. My scream caught in my throat as she raised a bony finger and pointed upstairs. I bolted to the window, smashing it open with a chair. Just as I climbed out, the whispers returned, growing louder, a cacophony of voices screaming at me to stop. I hit the ground running, not stopping until I reached my car. When I turned to look back, the house stood in eerie silence. I drove away, promising myself I'd never return. But as I sat in my room later, that night, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I noticed something strange. The mirror was too dark. The reflection too slow. It wasn't me staring back anymore. It began on a cold, damp evening when my cousin invited me to help clean out the attic of his late grandfather's house. The old house had been empty for months, sitting untouched on a lonely hill surrounded by dense woods. He had asked me to come along because the place gave him the creeps. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. The house was ancient, its wooden frame groaning in protest every time the wind shifted. The attic was the worst. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew clung to everything. It was crammed with boxes, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and old mirrors leaning precariously against the walls. A single, naked bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows. It was the kind of place that made your skin crawl for no good reason. That, as we worked through the clutter, sorting what to keep and what to toss, I couldn't help but feel like the shadows were moving. Every time I glanced at the mirrors, I thought I caught something out of place. Not me, not my cousin, but something else. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But the feeling wouldn't go away. We worked until the sun set, and darkness filled the attic. The bulb cast a sickly yellow light, barely illuminating the room. My cousin, sorting through an old trunk, suddenly froze and held something up. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle. He opened it, and the brittle pages crumbled slightly at the edges. It was filled with spidery handwriting, most of it illegible except for one phrase, which repeated over and over. "Don't let it in." My cousin laughed nervously, brushing it off as a weird quirk of an old man with too much time on his hands. But the air felt heavier after that, as if the room itself were holding its breath. We tried to shake it off and keep working, but the unease only grew. I felt like we were being watched. Every so often, I'd turn to look at the mirrors, and I could have sworn there was something wrong with our reflections. The movements weren't quite right, like a half-second delay. I said nothing, afraid of sounding paranoid. But then my cousin spoke up, his voice trembling. He asked if I'd noticed something strange. Before I could answer, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the sound of my breathing loud in the silence. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the rows of mirrors. That's when I saw it. In one of the mirrors near the back of the attic, there was a third reflection. It wasn't me, and it wasn't my cousin. It was taller, hunched, with impossibly long arms and a face that looked almost human but not quite right. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My cousin gasped. He saw it too. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Only the cluttered attic and the oppressive darkness. My hands shook as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was closer. It was staring directly at me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I grabbed my cousin's arm, my voice barely a whisper. We needed to leave, now. He nodded. and we stumbled down the narrow stairs, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. As we reached the hallway, we heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the attic. We didn't stop to investigate, we ran. The house seemed to twist and stretch around us, the walls closing in as we stumbled toward the front door. The scraping sound grew louder, faster, chasing us. Just as we reached the door, I turned back, unable to help myself. At the top of the stairs, it stood, the same figure from the mirror, hunched and grinning, its eyes fixed on us. But what made my blood run cold was the realization that it wasn't just standing there, it was holding the journal. The phrase "don't let it in" was scrawled across its body, etched into its skin like deep, angry scars. We burst out into the night, slamming the door behind us. The sound of the scraping stopped. The house loomed behind us, silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes watching us leave. We didn't speak as we drove away, too shaken to process what had happened. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know what we saw or how it was possible. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself avoiding mirrors, and every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see that twisted grin staring back at me. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a simple hike with a couple of friends. We were looking for a secluded spot to camp, a place where we could escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. It wasn't even supposed to be an overnight trip, but that night changed everything. We started out in the late afternoon, taking a trail that had been described to us as off the beaten path by some locals. It was supposed to be an easy trek, just a few hours to a nice, quiet clearing by a stream where we could set up camp and spend the evening. The air was crisp, the sky still clear, and everything felt perfect, at least for the first couple of hours. As we made our way deeper into the woods, we noticed something strange. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. I assumed it was just the stillness of the forest, but the longer we walked, the more unnerving it became. Even the wind had died down. The silence felt oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made your skin tingle and your senses go on high alert, as though something was watching you. We set up camp around dusk. A small fire crackled in the middle of the clearing, and we sat around it, trying to shake off the growing unease. We didn't talk much, which felt odd for a group of friends who usually couldn't stop chatting. The quiet was heavy. Then we heard it, a voice. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. Help? It came from somewhere beyond the trees, just barely audible. At first, we thought it was a trick of the wind, but it was too clear, too real. We all froze. I looked around at my friends, trying to gauge their reactions. They were just as unnerved as I was. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," one of them replied. "What the hell was that?" We all stood up, eyes darting around the campfire, trying to make sense of it. The voice came again, this time louder. "Help me." The words were desperate, frantic, almost pleading. Without thinking, we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the source of the sound. I don't know why we didn't stop. It didn't make sense. It was dark, we were in the middle of nowhere, and the voice sounded wrong, almost like it was coming from something not human. But we went anyway. The woods around us grew darker the deeper we went, the trees closing in. The air became thick, the chill biting at our skin. We followed the voice for what felt like an eternity, but it never seemed to get any closer. It was as if we were chasing a ghost, the sound shifting and moving, just out of reach. Then, we found it. A small clearing, barely big enough for all of us to stand in. At the center of it was a pile of rocks, and on top of the rocks was a crude carving, a symbol I didn't recognize, something old and unsettling. The voice stopped. We all stood there, staring at the rocks, unsure of what to do next. The silence felt suffocating. Then, we heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the distance. It was right behind us. "Help me." The voice was now right next to me, close enough that I could feel the cold breath against my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but darkness. My friends were in the same state of panic, spinning in circles, their flashlights flickering wildly. We didn't know what to do. Every instinct told us to run, but the path back was already obscured by the shadows. That's when I noticed it, a shadow. A figure, standing just outside the circle of our lights, barely visible but unmistakable. I stepped toward it, my heart racing. The other shouted for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I took another step forward, and the figure moved. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a black silhouette. No distinct features, just an outline that seemed to shift with the light. And then, it spoke again, but this time, it wasn't a plea for help. Leave. The voice was deep and unnatural, reverberating in my chest like a thunderclap. My friend screamed and pulled me back, dragging me away from the figure. We stumbled back through the trees, terrified and confused, not daring to look behind us. The forest seemed to open up before us, like the path had been waiting. When we made it back to the clearing where we had set up camp, the fire was out. The tents were gone, completely vanished. Everything was still, but not in the same way as before. It was a stillness that felt empty, like the forest had swallowed us whole and left nothing but the echo of our fear. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what we saw, or who or what had been calling us. But there's one thing I know for sure. The figure wasn't the thing we were supposed to fear. It wasn't the thing that wanted us to leave. It was the thing that wanted us to stay. It was late in the afternoon, and the park was starting to empty out. Most visitors had left for the day, and I was finishing up some paperwork in the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. There was a report of a strange sighting near one of the old trails, a popular spot, but not heavily trafficked. No one had gone out there in weeks, so the call struck me as odd. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed out, thinking it was probably just someone messing around. The air was crisp, and a thick mist had rolled in from the valley, making the trees look like towering shadows. The sun was setting fast, and the forest had a quiet, unnerving stillness to it. I made my way along the trail, the light from my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows across the path. The deeper I went, the more the mist seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Every twig that cracked underfoot sounded too loud, too unnatural. I paused a moment, listening for anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing, just the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard an unmistakable noise. A child's laughter. It echoed through the trees, high-pitched and clear. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching. There hadn't been any kids on the trail that day. And this wasn't the kind of sound you would expect to hear in the middle of the woods at dusk. The laughter was faint, almost playful, but there was something off about it. It didn't sound like a normal laugh. It sounded hollow, distant, as if it were coming from somewhere deep in the forest. I tried to brush it off, but then it came again, closer this time. Hello. I called out, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. No response. Only the laughter. Louder now, taunting and echoing through the trees. I hesitated, but I knew I had to investigate. I wasn't about to leave the woods in the dark without figuring out what was going on. I followed the sound deeper into the mist. The trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to grow taller and closer, casting dark shadows over the path. The laughter continued, now mixed with strange, choppy breathing, like someone was struggling to speak. The hair on my arms stood on end. I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There, standing at the edge of the path, was a figure, a little girl. She was dressed in an old-fashioned, frilly white dress that looked out of place for the woods. Her hair was long and tangled, falling over her face so I couldn't see her eyes. She was facing away from me, just standing there, perfectly still. My heart started to race, and the laughter stopped. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I forced myself to step forward, calling out to her, "Hey, are you lost? Are you okay?" She didn't move. I took another step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The moment my beam hit her, her head jerked up sharply. The face that met me was not that of a child. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin that was far too large for any human face. I stumbled back, the light flashing wildly around the trees. Suddenly, the mist shifted and parted in a way that felt unnatural, revealing a massive shape behind her. A shadow so large and dark it swallowed up everything around it. It was moving, slowly, like it was testing its weight with each step. I could barely make out a shape, something monstrous, towering over the little girl. It was like a large, misshapen figure, too blurry to be fully understood, but I could feel its presence in every bone of my body. The laughter came back, but now it was frantic, echoing from all directions. "Run!" I yelled at the girl, though I knew she wouldn't move. Without thinking, I turned and sprinted back the way I came, my flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of me. My breath was ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back, but I could hear the sound of something heavy moving behind me, the ground shaking with every step. I finally broke through the mist and back onto the main trail. The air felt suddenly lighter, and the world seemed normal again, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there, panting, looking around. No towering figure, no girl, no strange laughter. Just the normal sounds of the forest at night. It wasn't until I got back to the ranger station that I noticed it on the back of my neck. Just under my jacket collar was something damp. I reached up and pulled it off, and in my hand was a small tuft of hair, but it wasn't mine. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I always thought those stories were just exaggerated tales meant to scare kids. But that night changed everything. It started with a simple favor. A friend had asked me to house sit for the weekend while they were out of town. The house was old, a sprawling Victorian home with creaking wood floors and a reputation for being haunted. I laughed it off at the time. It was just a house. The first night passed uneventfully. I watered the plants, fed their cat, and binge-watched a few shows. The house had an eerie charm, with its antique furniture and dim lighting, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. On the second night, things started to feel off. The cat, normally calm and aloof, began acting strangely. She refused to stay in one room for long and hissed at empty corners. I dismissed it as animal behavior, though I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping over me. Later that evening, while I was reading in the living room, I heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. It wasn't subtle or distant. It was deliberate and heavy, as if someone was pacing back and forth. My chest tightened. The house was supposed to be empty. I stood frozen for a moment, listening as the sound stopped. Summoning my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the staircase. With each step up, the air grew colder. I tried to convince myself it was just an old house settling or my imagination running wild. The whole way upstairs was dim, the single light bulb flickering weakly. I walked toward the source of the sound, a guest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I felt a cold draft coming from inside. The room was empty, no intruders, no signs of anything out of place, yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I heard a third behind me, back toward the staircase. Whipping around, I shone my flashlight down the hall but saw nothing. My pulse was racing as I checked each room, finding nothing unusual. I finally decided I was overthinking it and went back downstairs, locking the bedroom doors behind me for good measure. That night, I struggled to sleep. The house was too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards made my nerves jump. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I strained to hear the words. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room near the window. I sat up, clutching the blanket, and turned on the lamp. The whispers stopped instantly. The room was still, but I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. I looked toward the window, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure standing outside. It wasn't clear, just the outline of something tall and motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe it was the wind outside. Determined not to let fear get the better of me, I decided to check the entire property in daylight. Nothing seemed out of place until I opened the basement door. I had avoided the basement all weekend. Something about it felt wrong, like a part of the house that didn't belong, but now I felt compelled to go down there. As I descended the creaky steps, the musty smell grew stronger, and the light barely illuminated the space. It was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but in the far corner, something caught my eye. A tall mirror stood there, covered in a heavy sheet. I approached it cautiously, unsure why I felt so drawn to it. Pulling the sheet away, I stared at my reflection. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, my reflection smiled at me. I didn't smile. I froze. watching as the image in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with a look of amusement. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if it were trying to come through. I ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, breathing in the fresh air as if I had been drowning. My friend returned the next day, and I told them I couldn't stay there again. I didn't mention the mirror. Weeks later, they called to tell me the strangest thing. The mirror in the basement had shattered on its own. But what really made my skin crawl was the discovery underneath the shards. Scratched into the wooden frame was my name, carved over and over again. The place we chose was remote, nestled deep in a forest where the only sound at night was the occasional hoot of an owl. The kind of place where you could get lost for days if you weren't careful. We set up camp just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, the glow of dusk filtering through the dense canopy. No one had ever been there before, but it was the perfect spot, quiet, peaceful, and far from the prying eyes of the world. Around the campfire, we joked, told stories, and roasted marshmallows, our laughter echoing off the trees. As darkness settled in, the forest around us grew still, and the cold night air made the fire feel even warmer. We were just beginning to relax when it happened. It started as a low rustling sound from the trees, too rhythmic to be an animal. We all stopped talking, staring into the shadows, trying to figure out what it was. The sound grew louder, and then, through the trees, came a soft whisper. At first, it was impossible to make out, but it seemed like it was calling our names. Faint but distinct. It felt wrong. Like something was waiting just beyond the firelight, watching us, knowing us. We all looked at each other, confused and uneasy. Probably just the wind, someone muttered. But even they sounded uncertain. We decided to go for a quick walk to stretch our legs and get some space from the unnerving whispers. The trees felt closer now, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out to trap us. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, but the more I walked, the stronger that sensation grew. My skin prickled, and my heart rate quickened. It felt as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then we heard it clearer this time, unmistakable. Help. The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away. We stopped dead in our tracks, listening. The air was thick, and even though we couldn't see anything in the dark, we could all feel it, the presence. It was so real that I swore I could almost taste the fear in the air. The voice came again, and this time it was closer. Help me, please. We didn't know what to do. There was no one else out here. It was just us. But the voice was unmistakable, and against every ounce of common sense, we started following it, moving deeper into the forest. As we walked, the whispers got louder, more desperate, and that feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was as if the trees themselves were closing in on us, their shadows shifting and flickering in the dim light. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center of it, lying on the ground, was a figure, a man. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his body stiff, and his face obscured by long, matted hair. For a moment, we stood there, frozen in disbelief. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge us. The whispers were now deafening, echoing all around us. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stepped closer, the others following behind me. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and as my fingers brushed against him, his head snapped around, eyes wide open and black as coal. His lips curled into a grotesque smile, and before I could pull back, he hissed in a voice that was no longer human, "You shouldn't have come." I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The others were already running, not looking back, but I was paralyzed with fear. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or what the hell had just happened. Then, I felt a tug on my sleeve. I whipped around, expecting to see the figure again, but instead, it was one of my friends, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here," he said. Voice shaking, we bolted back toward the camp, the forest seeming to stretch and warp around us, twisting the path like a maze. The whispers followed, growing louder, echoing in my head. As we reached the camp, I expected to find safety, but the fire was out. The tents had been torn apart. The place was a wreck, and that's when I saw the thing that made my blood run cold. Across the campfire's charred remains, written in the dirt, was one simple message: you were never meant to leave. It wasn't the forest we had gotten lost in. It was something far worse, something older. Something that had been waiting for us to step into its domain. The woods didn't just hold the memories of the past, they held something far darker. And now, we knew the truth, the voice, the whispers. They were never meant to guide us out. They were meant to keep us there, trapped forever, but we had escaped, at least for now. And as we hurried back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Because, as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I swear I saw the figure standing by the side of the road, watching us drive away. It started as a quiet night, the kind where you feel the weight of the silence pressing against your ears. I was dog-sitting for a friend at their house in the countryside. They had warned me it could get lonely out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and open fields, but I had shrugged it off. I enjoyed solitude, and I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was wrong. The house was small, cozy, with large windows that overlooked the woods. The dog, a large shepherd mix, had been restless all evening, pacing near the back door. I figured he just missed his owners. The night stretched on uneventfully. I fed him, let him out into the yard for a while, and finally settled on the couch to watch some TV. Around 11, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like something rustling against the side of the house. I muted the TV and listened, but everything had gone silent. I chalked it up to the wind. Living in the city had dulled my sense of how noisy the countryside could be. The dog, however, didn't seem convinced. He stood in the middle of the room, ears pricked, staring at the back door. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off. I called him over, and he reluctantly lay at my feet. I tried to focus on the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt colder, as if the warmth had seeped out through invisible cracks. At midnight, the sound came again. This time, it was louder. It wasn't just rustling. It was a deliberate, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked to the back door. The dog followed, his fur bristling. I flipped on the porch light. The yard was empty, the woods beyond it still and dark. The sound had stopped. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside to get a better look. The cold air stung my skin as I peered into the shadows. That was when the dog began to growl. A low, guttural sound that I had never heard from him before. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the yard, where the light didn't quite reach. I followed his gaze, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A tall, misshapen figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe it was just a shadow. But the dog's growl deepened, and his body tensed as if ready to pounce. I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. The dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. I tried to calm myself. I told myself there was nothing out there, that my imagination was running wild. But the unease didn't leave me. I decided to stay awake, just in case. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The dog had settled at my feet again, but his ears twitched at every creak and groan of the house. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft but insistent, coming from the back door. The clock on the wall read 3 in the morning. My heart raced as I got up and crept toward the door. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. I glanced through the window but saw nothing. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Then the knocking stopped. A moment of silence followed, then a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar. It was my own. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The dog began barking furiously. His body pressed against the door as if trying to protect me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The doorknob rattled, and the dog's barking grew frantic. I didn't know what to do. My hands shook as I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window. The yard was empty. The voice stopped, and so did the dog. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to look for any signs of what had happened. There were no footprints, no disturbed soil, Nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the door. Scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, were the words I had heard all night. "Let me in." The dog refused to go near the door for the rest of the day. Neither of us ever stayed in that house again. I've been hiking in the woods countless times, but there's one trip I'll never forget. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend getaway, nothing more than a few friends and me heading into a dense patch of forest to escape the city's noise and chaos. We picked an isolated area, far off the usual trails, where the trees grew thick, the underbrush dense, and the air smelled of earth and pine. We arrived in the afternoon, setting up camp in a small clearing. The sun was still high, and we joked about the spooky stories we'd heard from other hikers. But as evening drew closer, something in the air began to change. The forest felt alive, but not in the way it should. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker, the wind quieter. The air grew thicker with each passing hour. By nightfall, we had the campfire crackling in the middle of our small circle. We roasted marshmallows and told stories, the warmth from the flames making us feel safe. Then, the noise came at first. It was subtle, a soft scraping sound from the trees. We paused, staring into the darkness just beyond the fire's light. "What was that?" one of my friends asked. We all stood still, straining to hear. "Nothing." I figured it was just the wind, brushing against the branches. But then it came again, louder this time, a scratch, followed by a soft rustle, like something moving through the leaves. We all exchanged uneasy looks. "Maybe it's an animal," I said, though even I wasn't convinced. After a few moments of tense silence, we all tried to go back to our conversation, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest felt heavier, like something was watching us. It was around this time that I noticed a strange smell, something sour and sharp, like decaying meat. My stomach twisted, but I didn't say anything. It was probably just the smell of wet leaves or something else in the woods. We turned in for the night, all of us retreating to our tents, the sound of the fire still crackling behind us. I zipped my tent shut, trying to shake off the growing unease. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't ignore the noises around me. The scraping continued, closer now, like something was circling the campsite. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but every time I heard it, it was followed by a strange thud, something large hitting the ground, maybe a branch falling. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself I was just imagining things, but the noises weren't stopping. They were growing more deliberate, closer. Then, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a voice. "Don't look." The whisper was soft but clear, and it came from the darkness outside my tent. I sat up, wide-eyed, my breath caught in my throat. I was too scared to move, too scared to even call out to my friends. All I could do was listen. The voice repeated itself. "Don't look." Suddenly, there was a loud bang, like a fist slamming into the side of my tent. I jumped, my heart racing, but I couldn't bring myself to open the zipper. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, desperately trying to steady myself. Then, I heard the voice again, but this time it was closer, so close that I felt its breath against the fabric of my tent. "Don't look. Please." I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the tent, shining my flashlight into the forest. The beam of light swept across the trees, the clearing, but there was nothing. I scanned the area, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing moved. Everything was still. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, my eyes darting around the dark woods. My friends were all up now, standing in their tents, faces pale in the dim light of their flashlights. "What is going on?" one of them asked, his voice shaky. "Something's out there," I said, pointing toward the woods. I heard it. We all stood there, motionless, listening. There was a tense silence before the voice came again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't a whisper, it was a loud, guttural growl, right behind me. I spun around, but nothing was there. Just the thick trees and the inky blackness beyond the circle of our flashlights. "Run!" I gasped, panic rising in my throat. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our things and sprinted down the trail, not stopping until we reached the car. We didn't speak the whole way back to town, each of us too shaken to say anything. The next morning, we returned to the spot to see if we could figure out what had happened. We found no trace of anything unusual. No tracks, no signs of an animal, nothing, but there was something else. In the clearing where we had camped, there were 3 trees, side by side, with strange marks carved into the bark. They were deep, jagged slashes, almost like claw marks, and they looked fresh. But the most unsettling part, each of the marks was arranged in the shape of an eye. I thought I had chosen the perfect spot for our weekend camping trip, deep in the woods where we could escape the city and embrace nature. My friends and I, excited and eager, set up camp as dusk fell. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and the sounds of wildlife. It felt magical, a perfect escape from our mundane lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. Laughter echoed through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt right. But, as the stars began to twinkle above, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest felt alive, and not just with the usual sounds of nature. Something else lingered in the air, a palpable tension that made my skin prickle. Jenna, my adventurous friend, suggested a night hike. She had a knack for dragging us into questionable situations, and tonight was no different. Fueled by curiosity and the lingering adrenaline from the campfire, we agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and set off, the beam of light flickering over twisted branches and the underbrush. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The laughter faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. I tried to shake off the feeling that we were being watched, but Jenna kept pushing forward, excited by the thrill of the unknown. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A loud crash echoed through the trees, followed by a series of frantic wrestlings. My heart raced as we turned to face the direction of the noise. Fear clawed at my throat as a figure emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the dim light of our flashlights. It was a man, covered in dirt and leaves, his eyes wild and desperate. He stumbled toward us, breathing heavily, chains dragging behind him. I wanted to scream, but couldn't find my voice. The man's mouth moved, but no words came out. Panic surged within me, and I grabbed Jenna's arm, pulling her back. We stumbled over each other as we ran, adrenaline coursing through our veins. We ducked into a thicket of bushes, hearts pounding, praying we were hidden. From our hiding spot, we watched as the man continued to pace, his chains rattling. Then we noticed the lights. Tiny, flickering lanterns began to dot the forest floor, slowly illuminating a group of figures approaching from the shadows. They moved with an unnatural grace, their faces obscured by masks, their bodies swathed in tattered cloth. Each one held a lantern, casting an eerie glow that danced around the trees. I could barely breathe as they surrounded the man, whispering in hushed tones. The air grew thick with tension, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I was sure they had come for him. I squeezed Jenna's hand, fear tightening its grip on us. It felt like a nightmare, surreal and horrifying. The figures began to chant, their voices rising and falling in a haunting melody that resonated through the trees. The man's eyes widened in terror as he struggled against his chains, but it was useless. They closed in around him, and the air turned electric with anticipation. In that moment, I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a mix of terror and dread. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, their mask glinting in the lantern light, and I saw the empty eye sockets staring directly at me. I gasped and instinctively ducked lower, but not before I caught a glimpse of something chilling. The man wasn't just a victim, he was one of them. As the figures pulled him into their midst, he transformed before our eyes, joining their ranks, chains wrapping around him like a second skin. They began to move away, dragging him along, their lanterns flickering as they vanished into the darkness. We waited in silence until we were sure they were gone, our hearts still racing. We quietly retraced our steps back to camp, too terrified to speak. When we arrived, I gasped in horror. Our campsite was destroyed, tents slashed, supplies scattered, the fire smoldering. But the worst part was the message etched into the ground and that looked like dirt and ash. You should have joined us. We didn't look back as we packed our things and sprinted to the car, desperate to escape the forest grip. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the chains rattling in my mind, a haunting reminder of what lurked in the shadows. We were excited for our weekend camping trip, the four of us eager to escape the grind of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we arrived at our chosen spot. The site was remote, surrounded by dense woods that promised solitude and adventure. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and cooked hot dogs while sharing stories of past trips, laughing under the stars. As night enveloped the forest, a chill set in. We huddled closer to the fire, and Yena, always the jokester, suggested we play a game. She proposed truth or scare, a twist on the classic game. Each person had to tell a scary story or share a truth that no one else knew. It was all in good fun until it was my turn. With the fire crackling and shadows dancing around us, I began to tell the tale of a local legend, an old park ranger who vanished in the woods decades ago. They say he was searching for something he never found, and on moonless nights, you can still hear his chains rattling as he roams, looking for anyone who dares to camp in his territory. As I spoke, I noticed a flicker of unease in my friend's eyes, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere. After my story, we decided to take a short hike before bed. The darkness pressed in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. We laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the sounds of nature seemed to fade. It was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Suddenly, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard a distinct clanking sound, like metal against metal. My heart raced as we stopped in our tracks, exchanging worried glances. It echoed through the trees, louder now, like chains being dragged across the ground. Gina's face turned pale, and I could see her grip tightening around the flashlight she held. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We turned to retrace our steps, but the clanking grew louder, more frantic. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a sprint, the beam of our flashlights bobbing erratically as we stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear my friends gasping behind me, their breaths coming in quick bursts. Then we saw lights, flickering in the distance, moving slowly toward us through the trees. They were lanterns, glowing eerily in the dark. My instincts screamed to run, but curiosity held me in place for a moment too long. I wanted to see what was coming. The lanterns approached, revealing figures shrouded in shadows, their faces obscured by dark hoods. "Hide," I shouted, and we dove into the nearest thicket, hearts pounding in our chests. We crouched low, the clanking chains now deafening. Through the gaps in the bushes, we watched as the figures moved closer, each one carrying a lantern that illuminated their strange, unnatural movements. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They walked in a slow, deliberate line, each step synchronized, and I could see that they were bound together by chains. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me these weren't just people. They looked like some kind of ghostly procession. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, hidden behind the hoods but pale and sunken, as if they had emerged from a grave. Then, suddenly, they stopped. One of them turned, their lantern light sweeping across the bushes where we hid. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing our presence, and then continued on, the group moving as one again. We waited, terrified and breathless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When we finally emerged from our hiding place, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to camp, shaken but relieved to find our tents untouched. But as we approached, a chilling sight awaited us. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were the words "You should have stayed" hidden. In that moment, a wave of terror washed over us. We packed our things in silence, hearts racing, and bolted for the car, vowing never to return. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw the same figures standing among the trees, their lanterns flickering like dying stars. Camping in the deep woods had always been my escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life. I often went with a group of friends, but this time, I found myself alone. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the quiet of nature, and maybe indulge in a little stargazing. Little did I know how the night would unfold. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, a perfect spot nestled between tall pines and a clear, babbling brook. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, almost as if nature was welcoming me. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and prepared some snacks as the sky shifted from orange to deep indigo. As darkness settled in, the forest transformed. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but there was nothing, just a blank screen. I chuckled at my lack of foresight. No calls, no texts, just me and the wilderness. After a few hours of sitting by the fire, I decided to take a walk. I wandered along the edge of the brook, the water shimmering under the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful until I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the trees. I froze, straining to identify the source. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. The sound was similar to someone lightly banging a stick against a tree. Curious, I decided to follow it. As I moved deeper into the woods, the tapping grew louder, and with it came an unsettling feeling that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the area, the usual sounds of the forest replaced by an eerie stillness. My heart raced as I stood there, adrenaline coursing through me. I turned back toward the campsite, but paused when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood still, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. I squinted, trying to make out any features, but it was just a dark silhouette. Panic surged within me, and I took a step back. The figure moved, its outline blurring as it stepped further into the darkness, disappearing completely. I turned on my heel and ran back to the fire. My pulse pounding in my ears, I collapsed into my camping chair, trying to calm my racing heart. I reassured myself that it was probably just an animal, but the fear gnawed at me. The fire crackled loudly, illuminating the surrounding trees and keeping the darkness at bay, but my unease lingered. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to poke the fire and try to shake off the dread. Just as I did, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart sank. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. I felt like a child again, afraid of the monsters lurking in the dark. As I sat there, a movement caught my eye from the corner of the clearing. A figure emerged from the trees, this time much closer. I stood up abruptly, ready to confront whatever it was. The flashlight beam revealed a woman, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hands, trembling. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "What happened?" I asked, stepping forward. "They're coming for me," she stammered, looking over her shoulder. "I don't know what they want, but they won't stop." My instincts kicked in, and I gestured for her to sit by the fire. "You're safe here." "Who is coming?" Just then, I heard it again, the rhythmic tapping, now closer than before. The woman's eyes widened further, and she let out a small whimper. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I glanced into the darkness, the tapping now turning into a chorus of discordant knocks. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently, as if something had passed through the light. I turned to look at the woman, but she had vanished. My heart dropped, and I stumbled back, casting the flashlight all around me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the world tilting as panic set in. Then I heard her voice, echoing from the darkness. "They're here." I stumbled back to the tent, desperate to escape whatever was haunting me. As I unzipped the door and stepped inside, I took a breath to steady myself. I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them, the scene had changed. My campsite was now empty, devoid of any trace of my tent or the fire. All that remained was a crude drawing etched into the dirt where my campfire once burned. It read simply, "We will find you." I stumbled back, realizing I wasn't alone. The rhythmic tapping returned, echoing through the trees, but this time I was not the one being hunted. I had become part of their twisted game, and the night was just beginning. Most nights, I'm alone, keeping watch over the trails and ensuring everything's in order. I'm used to the quiet, the occasional howl of a coyote, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But that night, well, it changed everything. It was just after dusk when I got the call. There was a report of something strange near one of the far-off campsites. A few campers had heard what they thought was someone moving around their tents, but when they checked, they found nothing. They weren't sure whether it was an animal or something else. but they were nervous enough to ask for assistance. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. People get scared easily in the woods, especially at night. But something about the way the campers described it felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, preparing to head out. My truck rattled down the gravel road, the only sound the tires crunching beneath. The deeper I drove into the park, the darker it became. I reached the campsite around 9 p.m., the last traces of sunset disappearing behind the trees. The campers had already packed up and left, their tents gone, the fire pit cold and abandoned. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no broken branches, just the empty space they had left behind. I walked around the area, scanning the ground, looking for anything out of place. It was dead silent, no animal sounds, no wind, just stillness. It felt wrong, like the air was too thick. Then I noticed something strange. One of the tents had been left behind, rolled up and tucked into the corner of the clearing. That wasn't right. The campers had said they left in a hurry. Why would they leave their gear behind? I approached it cautiously, my boots crunching the frost-covered ground. My flashlight swept over the tent, and I stopped cold. The zipper was halfway undone, and there was something inside, a bundle of clothes. I pulled back the flap, thinking maybe they had left it behind in the rush. That's when I felt it. A cold draft, like something had just exhaled against the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood up. Inside the tent was nothing but an old, faded blanket, twisted up in the shape of a person. But it didn't make sense. There were no footprints leading to or from the tent. No evidence anyone had been inside for hours. I stepped back, scanning the surrounding woods, my breath quickening. I was suddenly very aware of the darkness pressing in around me, of how alone I was. That's when I heard an unmistakable sound. The crunch of footsteps in the underbrush, faint but distinct. It was coming from behind me. I turned around fast, shining my flashlight toward the sound. There was nothing, only shadows and trees. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was an animal, probably a deer, but the footsteps kept coming. I could hear them moving toward me, slow, deliberate. I could almost feel them, the way the air shifted, the brush being disturbed. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. My heart was hammering in my chest. I tried to steady my breath, but my legs were shaking. I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the trees, waiting for something to emerge. But nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just silence. I took one step forward, then another, trying to calm myself. I moved cautiously, back toward my truck, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the mind. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. There was a sound coming from inside my truck. A faint scratching, like nails dragging along metal. I slowly turned to face the vehicle, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound grew louder, more frantic. I knew I couldn't go back inside the truck, not with whatever that was. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the vehicle, and that's when I noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and spindly, its body unnervingly still. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to do something. I knew I had to get out of there. My legs were barely holding me up as I ran back to my truck, getting in as fast as I could. But the moment I slammed the door, the scratching stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I sat in the truck for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. But it wasn't until I started the engine and looked out the windshield that my stomach dropped. The figure was standing in front of my truck now, its face inches from the glass. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them pressing into me, cold and empty. Then it smiled, a wide, unsettling grin, stretching impossibly far across its face. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the woods, disappearing into the night. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I left the park that night and never returned alone after dark. To this day, I still don't know what I saw. I'll never forget the night my friends and I decided to take a trip to that abandoned house. It wasn't a grand plan. We were just a group of college students looking for something to do on a Saturday night, and when someone mentioned the old mansion at the edge of town, we all jumped at the chance. It had been sitting there, untouched, For years, just a hulking structure, faded by time and nature, covered in stories we had all heard but never truly believed. Everyone said it was haunted. Everyone said we were crazy to go. But of course, that only made it more tempting. We packed flashlights, snacks, and a camera for good measure. After a short hike through the overgrown path that led to the house, we finally arrived at the front door. It was exactly as we'd imagined, creaky, ancient wood with rusted metal hinges. The windows were boarded up, and ivy crept over the stone walls like it was trying to pull the house back into the earth. The kind of place you'd expect to be in a horror movie. We laughed nervously as we pushed the door open. The smell hit us immediately: mildew, dust, and something more metallic, almost like cold blood. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a long hallway with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered everywhere. We joked about how eerie it looked, but even I could feel the chill in the air, a sense of heaviness that made every step feel slower than it should. We decided to explore the house room by room, each more unsettling than the last. The living room was filled with shattered glass, and the dining room had a long table covered in rotting remnants of food that had long since turned to mush. There was an overwhelming sense that time had stopped here, that the place was frozen in some terrible moment, but we didn't stop. It was all part of the fun until we found the staircase. At the top of the stairs, the air felt different, colder. We shone our lights around, and that's when I saw it, a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a sudden urge to turn back, but curiosity won out. I led the way. The room behind that door was much smaller than the others, barely furnished except for a single rocking chair in the corner. It faced the wall, but something was odd about it. The floor around the chair was covered in what looked like old, faded chalk marks. I moved closer to get a better look, but then the air shifted. A loud creak echoed through the room, so loud it made my heart skip a beat. The chair moved just slightly at first, as though someone had shifted their weight in it. I froze. My friends looked at me, unsure of what to say. One of them whispered, asking if I had touched it. I hadn't. We all gathered near the door, the tension mounting, as the chair began to rock back and forth, slowly at first, then faster, as though something or someone was pushing it from behind. That was when we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. Leave. I didn't know if it was the wind, my imagination, or something else, but the voice was unmistakable. It was as though it came from all directions, vibrating through the walls and the floor. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The chair stopped. For a split second, I thought maybe we had imagined everything. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something, a reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. It wasn't mine. A figure stood behind me, its pale face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural grin. I whipped around, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The door slammed shut. We screamed, racing to get out, the floor creaking beneath our feet as we sprinted back down the hall, stumbling over the debris in our panic. As we finally reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt thick with something cold and suffocating. I was the last to reach the door, and just as my hand touched the handle, I heard it again, that whisper, leave now, or you'll stay. I yanked the door open, and we spilled into the night air, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. The house stood silent behind us, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, each of us too scared to speak, too shaken to process what had just happened. When we got home, we tried to laugh it off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. Something that didn't want us to leave. That night, as I was about to fall asleep, I checked my phone, and that's when I saw the message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The text was simple, chilling. You left too soon. I couldn't breathe. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, a little unsure of myself. "Hear what?" They replied, clearly distracted by the game. "I swear I heard something upstairs," I said. My voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, the door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps, no sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." I heard it, "It's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier. While I was still in my room, it said simply, "You're not alone."